Hey there, and welcome back. Whatever this day has asked of you, whatever you have carried through its long stretch, you can lay all of it down now and let the room soften and dim around you, and let your breath come slower and deeper. There is nothing more for you to do tonight. And so let us go a long way back together, more than 600 years, into an age of stone and candlelight and slow-turning seasons, and let us spend the night not as ourselves, but as someone else entirely. Tonight you are to be a great lady of the Middle Ages, the mistress of a noble house, with a stronghold about you and broad lands beyond its walls, and a household of many souls looking to you for their order and their bread. We are going to live a single day in that existence, from the cold dark before dawn to the banking of the last fire at night, and see what such a woman really did with her hours. What filled her time, and what weighed upon her, what beauty she knew, and what dangers, what it truly felt like to be one of the most fortunate women of that hard and distant age. It is a life further from ours than we sometimes imagine, hedged about with duties and rituals we have all but forgotten, and yet closer than we think too, for the women who lived such a life loved and feared and laboured and grew weary. Exactly as we do. Before the day is out, you will hold a whole house steady with your own two hands, sit in judgment over quarrels, ride out under a wide grey sky with a hawk upon your wrist, and learn the strange truth that a woman of this age was at once among the most powerful figures of her age and among the most bound. So settle yourself and let the centuries fall away, and let us step together through the gate of a fortress that has been dust for 500 years, on a morning when it was new. Before we cross fully over into that vanished world, there is one small thing I would ask of you, and then I will say no more about it. It is a soft companionship to me, in the hush of these slow hours, to know a little of who is keeping me company while the story unwinds. So if you feel inclined, you might leave a word below to say from what corner of the world you are listening tonight, and how late the hour has grown where you lie. I look through the notes that come, every one, and there is a soft pleasure in picturing all those scattered and shadowed rooms, each of them hushed, each given over for a while to the same old tale as the dark draws in. And if these slow wanderings into far-off centuries are something you would care to find your way back to, the simplest way is to subscribe whenever the wish should happen to come to you, offered gently and never pressed. And another of these long, quiet evenings will make its way to you in time. That is all of it. From here on, the night belongs to her. She, whose life we are about to enter, and to the great stone house that is waking around her in the dark. Picture this: a high stone chamber in the heart of a castle, deep in the last reach of the night, when the world outside is black and silent, and the cold has crept into every corner of the room. The fire on the hearth has burned down to a dim red glow, and the heavy hangings of the bed are drawn close against the chill, and within them, in the warm shadow, a woman lies sleeping among her women. For she does not sleep alone, this lady, and never has in all her life. Beyond the bed curtains, the chamber is crowded with the soft sounds of others breathing. The maids and gentlewomen who share her sleep as they share her days, lying on pallets about the room or in the truckle beds drawn out across the floor. Somewhere far below, in the great hall, the household servants are stirring already, raking the fires and hauling water, and somewhere out in the blackness a cock has begun to crow, and the first grey hint of the coming day is still a good while away. This is what we are entering, the daily round of a noble lady of the Middle Ages on an ordinary morning, and we are going to follow her, gently and without hurry, through every part of the long day that is about to begin. Let us draw back the curtain of the centuries, then, as softly as a maid drawing back the hangings of the bed, and begin. First, before the day itself begins, let us understand who this woman is, for everything that fills her hours flows from what she is, and her existence will make no sense to us until we grasp the strange foundations on which it stood. She is a noblewoman, one of a very small number of people, in a realm of many millions, who possess the land and the power and the wealth of the age. In this age, there are no factories and no banks and almost no money as we would understand it. There is only land, the fields and forests and villages that feed and clothe everyone alive. And the entire order is built upon who owns that land and who works it. At the bottom are the great mass of folk, the peasants who labour in the fields from dawn to dark, bound to the soil and to the lords who hold it. And at the top are the families like hers, the nobility, who keep vast estates not by working them, but by right of blood, and by the service they owe to those still higher, and who are owed in their turn the labour and the loyalty of all the folk below them. To be born into such a family was to be born into a tiny and a glittering minority, set as far above the common run as the towers of a castle stand above the huts of a village, and Our Lady was born into it, the daughter of one great house and now the wife of another, a woman whose blood and whose marriage place her among the few who rule. But her high birth, which lifts her so far above the common people, does not make her free. And this is the first thing we must understand about her, the strange double truth that shapes her whole existence. For a woman of this age, even the greatest, lived her life under the authority of men, first her father and then her husband, in whose keeping the law and the custom of the age placed her and all that she had. She did not choose her husband, he was chosen for her, while she was still a girl, by her father and his, in a bargain struck between two families over land and alliance, in which her own wishes counted for very little. She could not keep her lands in her own name as a man could, nor go to war, nor sit in the councils of the realm. In the eyes of the law she was, in many ways, the possession of the man she had married. And yet within those hard limits, she wielded a real and a daily power that few women of any later age would know. For the running of a noble house and a wide estate fell squarely upon her shoulders. And in that wide domain her word was very nearly law. She was at once subject and sovereign, bound and commanding, the most constrained of women, and among the most powerful, and it is in that strange doubleness that the deepest interest of her days lies. Hold that contradiction in your mind as we go, for we shall see it again and again before the day is done. Before she was a lady at all, she was a girl, and the making of a noblewoman began in earliest childhood, in a schooling unlike anything we would call by that name. Its whole purpose was to shape her for the single destiny that lay before her, a fitting marriage and the governing of a noble household, and everything she was taught bent toward that end. She grew up steeped from her cradle in the consciousness of her high blood, taught to know her rank and to carry it. And while she was still very young, she passed, while still a child, into the keeping of some other lordly roof, there to be finished among strangers. And there her true education began, not in the letters and the sums that a clerk might learn, but in the whole difficult art of being a lady of rank, an art learned by living it, day upon day, in the household of her elders. In that fostering family she was schooled, through all the years of her girlhood, in the long list of accomplishments that a lady must command. She mastered her manners above all, the grave and gracious deportment of her station, how to carry herself, how to greet the great and govern the humble, how to move through the ceremonies of a noble house with ease. She was taught to dance and to ride, to sing and to play, to sew and embroider with skill, to read in her own tongue, and perhaps a little Latin and the French that was the speech of the courtly world. She learned the running of a household, the keeping of stores, and the ordering of servants, against the day when she would govern one of her own. And she absorbed, from the songs and the stories all about her, the code of courtly love and noble conduct, the whole refined ideal of how a lady should be and how she should be served. All the while she served, too, as a junior attendant upon the lady of the house, waiting upon her, taught by watching, rising through the ranks of the gentlewomen as she grew. It was an upbringing, in short, designed to produce a finished article, a noblewoman polished and accomplished and fit to grace any hall in the land and to govern any estate to which marriage might carry her. Her own wishes, in all of this, counted for very little. She was being prepared, from infancy, for a destiny chosen by others. The marriage her father would arrange for the good of his line, and her schooling was the polishing of an asset against the day it would be bestowed. And bestowed it was, often while she was still very young, for a girl might be betrothed in childhood and married in her early teens, passing from her father's keeping to her husband's almost as soon as she was grown. So the bright accomplished girl became the mistress whose day we are coming to know, carrying into her marriage the graces and the skills of her long schooling, and beginning, very young, the heavy work of governing a great house and bearing its heirs. The carefree childhood that we think every child's right was not much known in her world. From her earliest years she was being shaped toward her duty, and she took up that duty more often than not, while she was scarcely more than a child herself. Above the world of the castle and the country estate there rose higher still, a realm, the world of the royal court, and to the very greatest of the ladies, that dazzling and dangerous place was the summit of all ambition, the centre toward which all the nobility turned. It was where the king held his state, surrounded by the mightiest of his subjects, and it was the fountain of all favour and all advancement, the place where fortunes were made and unmade, where the great matters of the realm were decided, and the rewards of loyalty bestowed. For a noble family to have a footing at court, to stand near the source of power, was the height of fortune, and for the women of such families, the chief prize was a place in the household of the queen. To serve the king's consort as one of her ladies, in the very heart of the glittering scene. To attend the queen was to live at the summit of the noble life, amid a splendour that outshone even the proudest private castle, in a household that was the model and the envy of all others. The queen's ladies waited upon her in her chamber, accompanied her in her state, shared in the ceremonies and the pleasures and the intrigues of the court, and lived close to the dazzling centre of the realm's power and wealth. It was a post of high honour, eagerly sought, for which families schemed and pressed, since to have a daughter near the queen was to have an ear at the heart of things, a channel of sway and favour that might lift the family's fortunes. And for the lady herself, it was a place of beauty and excitement and opportunity, of fine clothes and high company, and the constant nearness of the mighty, a brilliant stage on which an ambitious and accomplished woman might shine. But that world was as perilous as it was glittering, for the same closeness to power that made it so desirable made it deadly, and the higher one rose, the further one might fall. It was a place of endless intrigue and shifting favour, of factions and rivalries and whispered enmities, where a wrong word or a powerful enemy or the mere turning of a royal mood could bring a sudden and a ruinous fall. And the women there were caught up in all of it, their fortunes rising and falling with the currents of favour, their position never wholly secure. To serve a queen was a glory, but it could become a danger, for queens themselves could fall, and those who had served them too closely might be dragged down in their ruin. So it drew the great ladies as a flame draws the moth, with its dazzling promise of honour and influence and splendour, and like the flame, it could destroy as well as illuminate, the most brilliant and the most treacherous of all the arenas in which a noblewoman might seek her fortune. Now the day begins, and it begins in cold and darkness, long before the sun. In the black hour before dawn, there comes a stirring among the women of the chamber, and one of the maids rises from her pallet, shivering, to wake the fire and to rouse her mistress. The hangings of the bed are drawn back, and the cold air of the room rushes in upon the lady where she lies, and she wakes, as she is woken every morning of her life, not to silence and solitude, but to the presence of others, to the soft voices and moving shapes of the women whose whole purpose is to serve her. There is no lying abed in this world, no slow and private waking. The day is long and full, and it must be met, and so she rises into the chill, while the castle is still dark, and her women gather about her to begin the slow and careful business of making her ready. A basin of water is brought, cold or barely warmed, and she washes her face and her hands, for the people of this age were cleaner than we sometimes think, though they bathed seldom. And as she washes, the first words of the day are very often words of prayer, a murmured devotion offered up before anything else is done. For this is an age in which God is never far from the mind, and the day is begun, always, in his name. Then comes the dressing, and the dressing of a great lady is no simple matter, no quick pulling on of garments, but a slow and an elaborate ritual that could not be done alone and was never meant to be. Against her skin she wears first a long shift of fine linen, the one garment washed often and worn next to the body, and over this her women draw the kirtle, a closely fitted gown laced tight to the figure, and over that again a second gown, looser and richer, of fine wool or even of silk, trimmed perhaps with fur against the cold and falling in heavy folds to the floor. About her waist goes a girdle, often worked with metal and stones, and from it may hang the small, precious things of her daily world, a little purse, a set of keys, a tiny book of prayers. And upon her head goes the covering that marks her out as a wife, for a married woman of this age did not go bareheaded. Her hair, which only her husband might see unbound, is gathered and hidden away beneath a veil and a wimple. The soft white linen drawn about her throat and chin and over her hair, framing the face and concealing all the rest. Every part of this costume speaks, to those who know how to read it, of exactly who she is. The fineness of the cloth, the richness of the fur, the gold at her waist and throat, all proclaim her rank as surely as a banner. For in this age the law itself reserved such splendour to the nobility, and a woman dressed as she is dressed could be nothing but a noble woman. To be robed each morning was to be reminded, and to remind the world, of precisely what she was. It is worth lingering over the clothes themselves, for the dress of a noblewoman was among the chief glories and the chief labours of her life. A thing of astonishing richness and astonishing burden both, and it told the world at a glance precisely who she was. Next to the skin came the smock or shift of fine linen, the only washable garment, and so the only one washed with any frequency, soft and pale against the body. Over it went the kirtle, a gown cut close to the figure and laced tight, and over that the outer gown, fuller and grander, of the costly stuffs reserved to her rank. For these were not the rough wools of the common folk, but fine wool woven smooth as silk, and true silk besides, and velvet, and on the grandest occasions cloth shot through with threads of real gold, dyed in the deep and brilliant colours that only wealth could buy, the scarlets and the rich blues and the greens that cost a labourer's yearly wage to set upon a single gown. Fur-lined and trimmed her garments against the cold of the stone rooms, the soft grey and white of squirrel for every day, and the ermine of princes for the very highest. And the law itself took care that none below a certain rank should presume to wear such splendours, so that her very furs proclaimed her station. Upon her head sat the most telling sign of all, the covering that marked a married woman, for custom held that a wife must hide her hair, which only her husband might see loose. In the earlier centuries this was the wimple and veil, the soft white linen wound about the throat and chin and crowned with a veil over the hair, a grave and a nun-like framing of the face. But fashion, even then, did not stand still, and as the centuries passed, the headdresses of the great ladies grew ever taller and stranger and more wonderful, rising into horns and rolls and steeples and gauzy clouds of fine veiling, built up over frames of wire and stiffened cloth into shapes that astonish us still in the old pictures. About her waist she wore a girdle, often of worked metal set with stones, and from it hung the small treasures of her day. Upon her fingers were rings, at her breast a brooch, and looped through her hands a string of prayer beads of coral or amber or gold. To be dressed so was no light matter. It took the patient work of several women and the better part of an hour together, and once arrayed she could neither dress nor undress herself, nor move with much freedom, but only proceed, magnificent and constrained, through the slow ceremonies of her day. Her clothing was her armour and her banner, and her cage all at once, the visible sign of a rank that gave her everything and bound her in everything, and she wore it every waking hour, as the plain declaration of what she was. Among the most precious of the noblewoman's possessions, and the most truly her own, were her jewels, and they meant far more to her than mere adornment, for they were at once ornament and wealth and memory, all bound together in metal and gems. She wore them in profusion on the great occasions, rings upon her fingers, brooches pinning her gown and her mantle, chains and collars about her neck, a girdle of worked metal and stones at her waist, and looped through her hands the string of prayer beads, of coral or amber or pearl, both a holy object and a lovely one. These were the visible signs of her rank, flashing in the candlelight of the hall, proclaiming her riches and her station as surely as her furs and her fine cloth. But they were a great deal more than display, for in a time that knew almost nothing of banks, ornaments, and worked metal were among the chief forms in which value was kept and carried. For this reason, the jewels of a noble house were a kind of treasury on the person, a store of portable value that could be turned to use in time of need. In a hard year, or to raise money for a ransom or a war or a dowry, ornaments and plate could be pawned or sold, converted back into the silver they represented. And so the gleaming pieces a lady wore were not only beautiful, but useful, a reserve of worth she carried upon her own body. The broad vessels of gold and silver that graced the high table at a feast served the same double purpose, dazzling the guest's eye while quietly storing the riches of the house in a form that could be melted down if the worst should come. To own such was to be rich in the most solid and the most movable way that age allowed, and the treasures of a noble family were guarded with care and reckoned among its most important goods. But the jewels were dearest, perhaps, for the meanings and the memories they carried, for they passed from hand to hand down the generations and gathered stories as they went. A ring might be a betrothal token, a brooch a gift from a husband or a king, a jewel a treasure brought home from some far place, or handed down from a grandmother long dead. And a lady's ornaments were thus a kind of history of her life and her family, each piece tied to some person or occasion, to be worn with love and bequeathed with care. In her testament, she would dispose of them tenderly, this ring to a daughter, that brooch to a friend, the great collar to her heir, parcelling out among those she loved the bright and lasting keepsakes of herself. So her jewels were her riches and her adornment and her memory together, the most personal of her treasures in a life where she owned little else outright, and the truest expression, in gold and gems, of who she was and whom she loved. We have spoken often of the lady's women, the gentlewomen and maids, who surrounded her at every hour, and they deserve a chapter of their own, for the truth is that she almost never was alone, and the close fellowship of women was the very texture of her daily life. From her waking to her sleeping, she was attended, and more than attended, accompanied her women, dressed her and undressed her, served her at table, walked with her in the garden, sat beside her at the needle, rode out with her, knelt with her at prayer, and lay down to sleep in her very chamber. They were her servants. Yes, but they were far more than servants, for numbered among them were the daughters of other good houses, girls of gentle blood sent to serve and learn in her household, just as she herself had once served elsewhere. And these were her companions and her friends, as much as her attendants, the daily fellowship of her world. This female society had its own order and its own warmth. There was a hierarchy among the women, from the high-born gentlewomen, who were almost the mistress's equals, down through the waiting women to the humbler maids, each with her place and her duties. And the lady stood at the head of this small commonwealth of women as its mistress and its mother, responsible for their conduct and their welfare, their teacher and their guardian, in time the finder of their husbands. Within this circle, she lived the most intimate part of her life. These were the women who shared her secrets and her sorrows, who supported her through the perils of the childbed and rejoiced with her in her joys, who knew her as no man ever could. And the friendships and the rivalries and the loyalties of the chamber were the close emotional world in which she passed her days. The bonds among them could be deep and lifelong, the women who served a lady well rewarded and loved and remembered, stitched into the very fabric of her family's life. There is something here that we, who prize our solitude, must work to understand, for the lady knew almost nothing of solitude. Privacy as we cherish it scarcely existed for her. She was always attended, always observed, always within the warm and watchful circle of her women. And a private thought or a solitary hour was a rare and a difficult thing to come by. To us this might seem a kind of burden, a life lived forever on a stage, but to her it was simply the way of things, and the press of women was not a watching, but a sustaining, a constant presence that held her up through all the labours and the dangers of her days. She was born into company and lived her whole life so, and would die so, surrounded to the last by the women who had served and loved her. And the rich, close, crowded female world of the chamber was, for all its lack of solitude, one of the deepest comforts and one of the truest pleasures of her bounded life. Dressed and veiled, the mistress turns first, before any business of the day, to her devotions, for the daily round of a medieval woman was framed and ordered by religion, as ours is ordered by the clock. The day itself was marked out by the church, divided into a series of sacred times from before dawn to after dark, each with its appointed prayers, the slow tolling of the chapel bell calling the faithful to lift their hearts at the proper season. And so she goes, in the grey first light, to hear Mass in the chapel of the castle, that small jewelled room set aside for the worship of God, where the household chaplain waits to perform the sacred office. There, kneeling in the cold and the candlelight, she begins her day at the feet of God, as she has been taught to do since she was a small child, offering up the day that lies ahead before she has so much as broken her fast. Religion was not, for such a woman, a matter reserved for one day in 7. It was the very air she breathed, woven through all her days, the lens through which she understood her own world and the troubles and joys that filled it. The most treasured of all her possessions, very likely, was the small volume she carried with her to her prayers, the Book of Hours, and it deserves a moment of our attention, for nothing tells us more about the inner life of such a woman. It was a little volume, often no bigger than her hand, containing the prayers proper to each sacred season of the day, the devotions to the Virgin Mary above all, whom the people of this age loved and trusted as a mother. And the richest of these books were marvels of beauty, their pages glowing with gold leaf and bright paint, illuminated with little pictures of the Virgin and the saints, so fine that they seem, even now, to shine from within. Such a volume was at once a tool of devotion and a treasure of great price, an object to be commissioned at vast expense, cherished through a lifetime, and handed down to a daughter as one of the dearest of legacies. Through its leaves the lady ordered her own days, marking the seasons with the prayers they required, drawing comfort in her sorrows and giving thanks in her joys, and into its margins she might whisper her own most private hopes. Her longing for a safe childbirth, her grief for a child already lost, her fear of the dangers that pressed upon every life in that uncertain age. To hold it was to hold the whole inner world of a medieval woman in the palm of one hand, her faith and her fear and her love all bound together in gold and vellum. That little book of hours she carried to her prayers is worth a closer look, for it was very likely the loveliest object she owned, and the making of it was a labour of months or years and a marvel of the craftsman's art. There was no printing yet in the earlier centuries of her world, and every book was made by hand, copied and painted, letter by letter and stroke by stroke, so that a written volume was a rare and a costly thing, a treasure commissioned at vast expense and owned only by the wealthy. Such a book began as the skins of animals, scraped and stretched, and cut into the smooth pale leaves we call parchment or vellum, upon which a scribe would write out, in a fine clear hand, the prayers and psalms it was to contain. But the writing was only the beginning, for the glory of such volumes lay in their pictures, the work of the illuminators who adorned them. These artists worked with colours ground from precious things, with gold beaten into leaf, so thin it seemed to float, with a deep and brilliant blue, made from a stone carried all the way from the east, and worth, ounce for ounce, near the price of gold itself. With these they wrought into the margins and across whole pages, little scenes of wonderful delicacy and brightness, the Virgin and the Christ child, the saints in their glory, the scenes of holy story, all framed in borders of leaves and flowers and strange small beasts, the whole glowing from the page as if lit from within. The richest of them took years to complete and cost a fortune, and they were made to be treasures, bound in covers of worked leather or velvet, clasped with gold, sometimes set with jewels. And they were personal in a way that touches us still, for a lady might have her own copy made to her own taste, with the saints she loved given pride of place, with her family's arms set in the borders, even with a small likeness of herself, kneeling in prayer before the Virgin, worked into the page. So the volume she held was not only a tool of prayer, but a portrait of her soul and a treasure of her line, the single most precious of all her things, and she used it and loved it and handed it down. Through its pages she ordered her devotions, day by day and season by season, into its margins. In the blank spaces left for the purpose, she or her children might note the great events of the family, the births and the marriages and the deaths, so that it became, over the generations, a record of the family as well as a guide to heaven. And when she died, this above all she would leave to a beloved daughter, the painted treasure that had been her companion through all the joy and sorrow of her life, to be loved and used and written in by another generation in its turn. Few things bring us closer to the inner life of such a woman than these little glowing volumes, in which her faith and her family and her sense of beauty are all bound up together, glowing as freshly now in some few survivors, as on the day they were made. It is worth pausing on the holy ones to whom she turned, for they were as real and as present to her as the living people about her, a great company of helpers and protectors to be called upon in every need. Above them all stood the Virgin, the Mother of God, gentle and merciful, to whom a frightened woman might turn as a child turns to its mother. But there were others, each with its own care and its own power, a whole host of the blessed ready to intercede. There was the saint who had come unharmed from the belly of a dragon, and was therefore believed to watch over women in the terror of childbirth, and whose name was breathed in the birthing chamber by each labouring mother who could afford a priest to read her story aloud. There were patrons for the healing of sickness, for the finding of what was lost, for safe travel and good harvests and peaceful death. To the modern mind this may seem a crowded and a curious heaven, but to the medieval woman it was a source of deep and daily comfort, the sure knowledge that she was never alone. That for each fear that troubled her, there was a friend in heaven to whom she might cry and who would carry her prayer to the throne of God. Her religion was not cold and distant, but warm and peopled, full of mercy and of help, and it sustained her through trials that would have broken a soul with nothing to lean upon. Among all the holy company to whom the noblewoman turned, one figure stood high above the rest, nearer and dearer than any, and that was the Virgin Mary, the bearer of the Lord, whose worship was at the very heart of the belief of that age. To the people of the Middle Ages, she was the great intercessor, the merciful one who stood between sinful humankind and the awful justice of heaven, and who could be trusted, as a mother is trusted, to plead for her own before the throne of her Son. A frightened or a grieving woman might find in her a sympathy beyond that of any man saint or stern judge, one who had herself known joy and sorrow, who had borne a child and watched him die, and who understood, as only she could, the hopes and the fears that filled a woman's world. And so the devotions of the lady turned again and again to Our Lady. The very prayers of her primer were built around the worship of Mary, and her deepest pleas in her hours of need rose to the gentle Queen of Heaven. But Our Lady was not alone in her special care, for there was a whole company of holy women, the female saints, to whom the Lady felt a particular nearness, for they had lived as women and known the things that women knew. There was the holy maid who watched over childbirth, called upon in each birthing chamber, whose story was read aloud to labouring mothers as a charm against the perils of the hour. There was the bookish virgin saint, patroness of young girls and of study, who had confounded the cleverest men of her age with her arguments before she died for her faith. There was the mother of the Virgin herself, the grandam of the Lord, to whom wives prayed for offspring and safe delivery. And there were others, each with her own story of courage and faith and terrible martyrdom, who stood as guardians and protectors of the women who loved them. These were not remote and abstract figures, but real presences in her life. Friends in heaven, to whom she spoke daily, whose images she kept, whose feast days she kept with joy, and whose help she sought in every trouble. This great cloud of holy helpers was the warm and crowded heaven of the medieval woman, and it gave to her devotion a tenderness and an intimacy that we should not overlook. Hers was not a creed of cold doctrine and distant judgment, but of mercy and companionship, peopled with mothers and protectors and friends who knew her needs and would carry her prayers to God. She wore their images about her neck, kept their relics where she could, made pilgrimage to their shrines, and called upon them by name in every fear and joy, and in the hardest passages of her hard existence. In the terror of the childbed and the grief of the graveside, it was to these holy women, above all, that she turned, sure that they understood, sure that they would help. To enter her faith is to enter a world thronged with merciful presences, and to understand how a woman so bounded and so endangered could yet face her life with courage, knowing herself surrounded on every side by the love and the protection of heaven. Her devotions done, the mistress turns now to the true labour of her day, the governing of her household, and here lies the heart of what such a woman really did with her hours, for she was, above all else, the mistress and manager of a great enterprise. We must put out of our minds the idle image of a noble lady drifting through her days at her embroidery, for the truth is far busier and far more impressive. A castle and its estate were a vast and an intricate concern, a working community of dozens or even hundreds of souls, and all of it had to be fed and clothed and ordered and kept through fat years and lean, through peace and war and the long siege of winter. And the daily running of that whole machine fell squarely upon the lady. She was, in modern terms, the manager of a large and a sprawling enterprise, and she ran it. Beneath her stood a small army of servants, the cooks and the bakers and the brewers, the chambermaids and the laundresses, the grooms and the scullions, and over the whole company her word was law. She directed them, judged their work, settled their quarrels, and saw that each kept to his task, so that the food appeared upon the tables, and the fires were lit, and the linen washed, and the long, intricate dance of a noble household went forward without a stumble. Let us look more closely at the place in which all this life went on, the castle itself, for it was a stranger dwelling than the snug homes we know, and to understand her we must understand the stone world she moved through. A castle of any size was three things at once, and never quite comfortably any of them. It was a fortress, built to keep out an army. It was the centre of government for a wide estate, and it was a home, where a family and its vast household ate and slept and lived. At its heart stood the great hall, an enormous raftered chamber open to the roof beams, and here the bulk of the household's waking life was spent, for here they ate, here much business was done, and here, at night, many of the servants simply lay down to sleep upon the rush-strewn floor. Off the hall and above it lay the more private rooms, the solar or great chamber where the lord and lady might withdraw from the press of the household, the bedchambers, the chapel where mass was heard, and below and around lay the working parts, the kitchen set a little apart for fear of fire, the cellars and storerooms heaped with the provisions, the lady guarded, the stables and the workshops, and the quarters of the garrison. It was, by our soft standards, a hard place to live, for all its grandeur. The stone walls held the cold and the damp, and the fires and the candles could never quite drive them out, so that the rooms were chill and draughty for much of the year, and dim always, lit only by small windows and smoking flame. Privacy, as we understand it, scarcely existed, even for the greatest. The mistress slept among her women. The lord conducted his business in the room where he slept, and a person might pass a whole life almost never alone. The floors were strewn with rushes and sweet herbs to soften them and to mask the smells. The walls were hung with woven tapestries, as much to keep out the draughts as to please the eye. And through all the rooms moved the constant traffic of a community of dozens or hundreds. The servants and officers and guests and hangers-on who made up the household of a mighty lord. It was crowded, cold, smoky and magnificent, a world of stone and shadow and rich colour, and it was the only home she knew, the great machine she governed, and the splendid prison in which she passed her days. Her cares ran far beyond the ordering of servants, into the harder business of provision and account. The storerooms and the pantries of the castle were her domain, and into them she had to look with a careful eye, for upon what was laid up there might depend the survival of the household through a hard winter or a siege. Salted meat and dried fish, grain and ale, and candles and firewood, all had to be gathered in their season, counted, guarded against waste and theft and rot, and made to last until the next harvest. And a lady who managed her stores poorly might find her people hungry in the cold months, while one who managed them shrewdly could hold a castle through a year of war. Nor was that all, for she kept the accounts too, or oversaw their keeping. The close rolls on which were set down the rents that came in from the estate and the monies that went out, the whole tangled reckoning of a wide property. And she had to understand it, to question it, to know whether her stewards and bailiffs were honest, and her lands were yielding what they should. She was, on top of everything else, the physician of her household, for there were few doctors in that age, and fewer still within reach of a country castle. And so the healing of the sick, and the dressing of wounds, and the brewing of remedies from the herbs of her own garden, fell to the lady and the women under her. To run such a household was to hold 100 threads at once, and to let none of them fall. Behind the splendour of the castle and the comfort of the high table lay a vast and intricate machine for the getting of wealth. The estate and the noblewoman's part in keeping that machine running was real and constant, especially when her lord was away. The wealth of a noble family flowed, in the end, from land, from the broad fields of one or many manors scattered across the country, tilled by the labour of the peasants who held their little plots, in return for rents and dues and days of toil upon the lord's own ground. From these manors came the income that fed and clothed and adorned the noble house, the rents paid in money and in kind, the corn and the cattle and the wool, the fees and fines of the manor courts, the profits of mills and markets and fairs, the whole slow harvest of a landed fortune. And all of this had to be gathered, recorded, guarded, and spent in a perpetual round of management that never ceased. For an estate left to run itself would soon be plundered and run down. To govern such a property took a whole army of officers, and over them, when the Lord was absent, she held sway. There was the steward, the chief officer who oversaw all the Lord's lands and presided in his name. There were the bailiffs who ran the scattered manors, and the humbler officers drawn from the peasants themselves who saw the daily work was done. And there were the clerks who kept the accounts, the close rolls of receipts and expenses by which the whole enterprise was reckoned and checked. The auditing of these accounts was a serious business, for upon it depended the catching of waste and theft, and a sharp-eyed lady who understood her figures and questioned her officers closely could save her family a fortune, while a careless one might be quietly robbed for years. So the lady learned to read an account, and to weigh a steward's word, to know what her acres should yield, and to demand it to drive a hard bargain with a merchant, and to defend her family's rights against every encroachment. There was, too, a curious restlessness to the world of a noble household, born of this same economy, for a single estate could not easily feed so many mouths in one place for long, and the yield of the scattered manors could not all be carried to one castle. And so the whole household often moved, packing up its goods and its people, and travelling from one of the Lord's houses to another, consuming the stores of each in turn, and bringing the Lord's justice and presence to his far holdings, before moving on again. The lady moved with it, or sometimes stayed to govern one seat, while the Lord held another. And the management of these removals, the packing and the carriage and the provisioning of a household on the road, was itself a considerable labour. The estate, in short, was a living thing that demanded endless care, and she was one of its chief keepers, mistress not only of a beautiful house, but of the hard economic engine that paid for all its beauty. And there were times when all of it, and far more besides, fell upon her alone, for the lord of the castle was very often gone. He might be gone for months or even years together, summoned to the wars, sent on the king's business, riding to a distant court, or journeying as a pilgrim to some far holy place. And when he rode out through the gate, he left behind him not a helpless wife but a deputy, a woman who must now hold his lands and his power in his stead until he should return, or never return at all. In his stead, she became, in all but name, the Lord herself. She presided over the manor court, that gathering where the disputes of the estate were judged and the law of the Lord enforced, sitting in judgment over quarrels of land and debt and trespass among the people who looked to her for justice. She dealt with the leading folk of the neighbourhood, and the merchants who came to trade, defended the rights of the estate against those who would encroach upon them, and bore upon her own shoulders the full weight of a domain that the law said she could not even own. It was a heavy trust and a real power, and the women of this age bore it more often than we remember, holding together the lands and the fortunes of their houses through the many absences of the men. When the Lord was absent and the mistress ruled in his stead, one of the gravest of the powers that fell to her was the doing of justice. For a wide estate was not only a property to be managed, but a community to be governed, and the governing of it meant the holding of pleas and the judging of disputes. The lord of a manor held by old right a court of his own, before which the folk of his domain were bound to come, and in which the affairs of the whole community were ordered and its quarrels resolved. And when the lord was away, it was the lady who presided over it in his place, sitting in judgment over the men and women of the estate. It was no light thing to take that seat, for the matters that came before the manor bench touched the very stuff of people's lives. Disputes over the holding of land, quarrels over boundaries and debts and inheritances, the dues and labours owed by the tenants, the petty crimes and trespasses of a country community, all were brought before that bench for settlement, and her word upon them was law. To do this work well, a lady needed a real knowledge of the law and custom of the manor, that great unwritten body of usage by which such communities were governed, and a real shrewdness in the weighing of evidence and the judging of men. She did not sit alone, for the steward and the officers of the estate were there to advise her and to carry out her judgments. But the authority was hers, and the harder decisions fell to her. And a lady who judged wisely and fairly won a respect that strengthened her whole standing in the country. She had to settle the quarrels of her tenants, to defend the rights of the estate against those who would encroach upon them, to see that the dues were paid and the customs kept, and the peace maintained across her lord's broad lands. And in all of this, she wielded an authority over the lives of others that few women of any later age would know: the power to judge, to fine, to order, to set right. Nor did her authority end at the bounds of her own estate, for a noblewoman in her lord's absence was a power in the whole neighbourhood, to be reckoned with by every other lord and every official for miles around. She dealt with the king's officers and the courts of the realm, defended her family's interests in the endless disputes over land and title that filled that litigious age, wrote letters of business and of petition, and held her own in the rough and tangled politics of the countryside. The lady who could not do these things would see her family's interests suffer. The lady who could do them well was a pillar of her line, guarding its rights and its lands through every absence of its lord. It is one of the truest correctives to the old idol picture of the medieval lady, this image of her upon the seat of justice, hearing the causes of her people and giving judgment among them. For here was no ornament but a ruler, a woman wielding, in her lord's name, and often in her own name, the hard and necessary power of the law. Though she was barred from all formal office of power, could hold no crown and sit in no council, and command no army, the noblewoman of this age wielded a real and a subtle sway through other channels, and it would be a mistake to measure her standing only by the offices denied her. Much of the true business of politics in that world was done, not in the council chamber, but in the private dealings of the powerful, in the weaving of marriages and the binding of alliances, the quiet hint in the right ear, and in all of this women played a central part. A noblewoman stood at the heart of a wide web of kinship and connection, and through that web she could work, advancing her family's interests, smoothing its quarrels, binding it by marriage to other great houses, in a constant patient labour of alliance building that was among the truest forms of mastery the age knew. The arranging of marriages, in particular, was very much women's work, and to match the young people of the great families well. To weave the alliances that strengthened a house was to shape the politics of the realm. Closer to home, the mistress wielded the deep, informal sway of influence over her own lord, for a husband who trusted and valued his wife would listen to her counsel, and a wise woman could often work through persuasion what she could never command by right. The whispered word, the patient argument, the steady pressure of a trusted voice, could turn a lord's mind and bend his decisions. And many a powerful man's course was set in part by the counsel of the wife who shared his confidence. And there was, too, the ancient and honoured role of the intercessor, the woman who begs for mercy, which gave to her a sway both real and revered. For it was held fitting that a woman should soften the harshness of men, should beg pardon for the condemned and mercy for the fallen. And a lady kneeling to intercede for the doomed mirrored the Virgin herself, pleading for sinners before the throne of God. By such pleading a woman might save lives and turn the course of events, wielding an authority all the greater for being clothed in the gentle form of mercy. So we must not imagine the noblewoman as powerless, merely because she held no office, for the channels through which she worked, though informal, were deep and real. And through them, women shaped the affairs and the fortunes of their age more than the bare record of offices and titles would ever show. She built and broke alliances, counselled the powerful, brokered the marriages on which the whole order of the nobility rested, pleaded for the fallen, and manage the wide affairs of her family with a sure and constant hand. Hers was a sway exercised from behind the throne rather than upon it, through persuasion rather than command, through the web of kinship and the bonds of marriage and the trust of those who held the formal office. But it was power nonetheless, and the noble women of this age were forces to be reckoned with in the deep currents of their age, shaping by patient and subtle means the destinies that the men around them claimed to rule. And when the Lord was gone to war, and the enemy came, it was sometimes the lady who had to defend the castle itself. This is the part of her story most often forgotten, and the most startling, that more than one proud lady of this age, with her lord dead or captive or far away, took up the command of his fortress and held it against an army. She could not fight in the press of battle, for that the custom of the age forbade, but she could command, and provision, and hearten, and endure. She could see the walls manned and the gates barred, and the stores rationed, could keep the courage of the garrison from failing through the grim weeks of a siege, could treat with the besiegers and play for time and refuse, week after week, to yield. There are tales, well attested and not invented, of ladies who held their walls against the king's own forces until the attackers gave up and withdrew, of women who governed a siege with as cool a head as any captain. It was a rare and a desperate duty, but it was a real one. And it shows us how far the truth of these women stands from the gentle and helpless picture we have inherited. The mistress of a great house might, on a bitter day, become the keeper of a fortress and hold it. Let us dwell a moment on that most startling of a lady's duties, the defence of a castle under siege, for it happened oftener than the gentle tales would have us believe, and it shows the iron that lay beneath the silk. Picture the situation. The lord dead, or captive, or away across the sea at the wars, and an enemy host come down upon his lands, and within the walls only the noblewoman, her women, a handful of fighting men, and the folk of the estate fled in for shelter. Upon her now falls everything. She cannot ride out sword in hand, for that the custom of her age forbids, but she can do all the rest. And on her doing of it hang the lives of every soul behind the gates. She must see the gates barred and the ramparts manned, the stores of food and water counted and rationed against a long blockade, the wounded tended and the frightened heartened, the watch kept day and night against assault or treachery. She must be everywhere, calm when others panic, resolute when others would yield, the steady heart of a desperate defence. The chronicles of the age preserve more than one such defence, set down by writers who marvelled at them, and they were no inventions of the romancers. There is the tale of a lady who, with her lord away, met the king's own host before her walls and would not give them up, throwing back assault after assault and answering every demand to yield with defiance until the siege was at last abandoned. There is another of a woman who, with her husband taken captive, held his stronghold through a long blockade, enduring hunger and bombardment and threat, and surrendered to no promise and no menace. To treat with the besiegers, to play for time, to keep up the spirits of the defenders through the grinding weeks of hunger and fear, to gamble that relief would come before the place was stormed, called for a coolness and a courage that any captain might envy. And the women who showed it have earned a place in the story of their age that the spinning wheel and the embroidery frame could never have won them. It was a desperate and an exceptional duty, this holding of a fortress, not the common stuff of a lady's days, but that it could fall to her at all, and that so many rose to it so magnificently, tells us much about the real steel of these women. The same hands that worked the fine embroidery could ration a garrison and order a defence. The same voice that sang in the lamplit hall could rally frightened men upon a rampart at dawn. Beneath the soft wimple and the heavy gown was a person bred to responsibility and capable at need of the hardest and the highest command. We do the medieval lady a deep injustice when we picture her only as a decoration of the hall, for when the worst came, as in that violent age it often did, it was she who held the gate. And more than one great house owed its very survival to the courage of a woman upon its walls. But let us return to the ordinary day, where the late morning is wearing on, and the chief meal of it is drawing near. For the chief event of the daylight hours, around which so much of the household's life revolved, was dinner. It was taken not in the evening as ours is, but near the middle of the day, and it was served, on any day of consequence, in the hall, that vast raftered room which was the very heart of the castle, where the household gathered to eat together beneath one roof. There was a deep order to the seating, for this age loved degree and rank above almost all things, and where a man or woman sat at dinner declared exactly what they were. Upon the raised dais at the head of the room sat the lord and lady and their honoured guests, set apart and lifted up, and below them, ranged down the long tables that ran the length of the room, sat the rest of the household in their order of importance. The gentlefolk nearer the dais, the humbler servants further off, each in his appointed place. A great silver vessel of salt stood upon the Lord's board, and to sit above it or below it was to know your station in a single glance, for salt was precious, and nearness to it was honour. The meal itself, at the high table of a great house, was a thing of real magnificence, far richer and stranger than we might suppose. Dish followed dish in slow procession, brought in with ceremony by the serving men, and presented first to the lord and lady, roasted meats of every kind, for the nobility ate flesh in heavy quantity when the church allowed it. Fowl and venison and the beasts of the chase, fish in plenty on the many fast days when meat was forbidden, rich pottages and pies, breads of fine white flour, and all of it heavily spiced. For spices were costly, and to use them freely was to display one's wealth upon the very tongue. Wine was poured for those of rank, ale for the rest, and the meal was conducted with a grave courtesy, the washing of hands before and after, the careful carving, the offering of the finest morsels to the most honoured. And when the great folk had eaten their fill, what remained did not go to waste, but was carried out to the poor who gathered at the castle gate, so that the ladies' table fed, at one remove, the hungry of the whole neighbourhood. To preside over such a meal, gracious and watchful at her lord's side, was one of the daily duties and one of the daily pleasures of her existence. The ordinary dinner of an ordinary day was one thing, but on the great occasions, the high feasts of the church and the rejoicings of the house, a wedding or a churching, or the visit of some mighty guest, the hall blazed up into a splendour that we can scarcely imagine, and the feast became a work of art and a weapon of policy both. For days beforehand, the kitchens laboured, the cooks and their armies of helpers toiling over the open fires to prepare a banquet that might run to many courses and dozens of dishes, each more elaborate than the last. There were whole roasted beasts and birds brought in upon broad chargers, the peacock and the swan sometimes sewn back into their feathers to seem alive, the boar's head borne in with ceremony. There were rich stews and pies and fish of every kind. And between the courses, to amaze the guests, the cooks sent out their subtleties, fantastical sculptures of sugar and paste shaped into castles and beasts, and scenes of story, marvels made to be admired before they were eaten. Everything about the feast was contrived to display the wealth and the standing of the house, and nothing more so than the spices. For pepper and saffron and cinnamon and ginger came from the far ends of the earth at enormous cost, and to scatter them freely over every dish was to spread one's riches upon the very table. The serving of such a meal was itself a grave ceremony, conducted by officers of rank, the carver who cut the meats with practised art, the cupbearer who poured the wine, the server who bore the dishes in their proper order, the ewer who brought the scented water for the washing of hands. The diners ate from thick slices of bread called trenchers, rather than from plates, and these, soaked with the juices of the meal, were given afterward to the poor. And all the while the minstrels played in the gallery, and there might be dancing and disguisings and the telling of tales between the courses, so that the feast was entertainment and spectacle as much as it was food. Over all of it presided the lord and the mistress, gracious at the high table, and to order such a banquet well, to feed and dazzle a hall full of noble guests, was one of the proudest displays of a lady's command of her house. One duty above many marked out the truly noble household, and that was open hospitality, the open-handed receiving and lodging of guests, and the burden and the honour of it fell in large part upon the lady. In an age with few inns, and those few held unfit for persons of rank, the traveller of any standing depended upon the welcome of the noble halls along his road, and the gates of a lordly hall stood always open to receive him. A constant stream of guests passed through such a house, lords and their retinues riding between their estates, clergy upon the business of the church, the king's officers and messengers, kinsmen and neighbours and friends, the great and the humble alike, claiming the shelter that custom and Christian duty required the house to give, to receive them well, to see each lodged and fed and treated according to his degree, was a mark of the family's standing and generosity, and a household known for its open door won a name and a goodwill worth more than gold. The managing of this endless flow of visitors fell to her, and it was no small part of her work. She must see that there were always provisions enough to feed unexpected arrivals, beds enough to lodge them, servants ready to wait upon them. She must judge the rank of each guest, and order his welcome accordingly. The highest given the finest chambers and the high table, the humble fed and sheltered more modestly, but never turned away. A sudden arrival of some mighty lord with a train of dozens, descending without warning upon them, could throw the whole household into a frenzy of preparation, and it was the lady's part to meet it with grace, to make the greeting seem easy and glad, however hard the scramble behind the scenes. For an honoured guest, a feast would be prepared, the hall made splendid, the best of everything brought out. For the welcoming of a weighty visitor was a chance to display the wealth and the courtesy of the family, and to bind a useful friendship closer. There was real meaning in all of this beyond mere display, for hospitality was woven deep into the values of that world, held a holy duty and a Christian grace. The sheltering of the traveller and the feeding of the stranger being among the very works of mercy the faith commanded. To keep a free board, open to guest and pilgrim and poor wayfarer alike, was to live as a noble family ought. And the mistress who governed such a place with grace and bounty was honoured for it through the whole country. So the doors stood open, and the table was spread, and the mistress stood ready, day after day, to greet whoever should ride in through the gate, to make them welcome in her hall, and send them on their way refreshed. And in this constant, gracious receiving of the world, she practised one of the central arts of her station, the turning of a noble seat into a place of refuge and a house of honour. When dinner is done, and the hall cleared, she withdraws, as she does each afternoon, to the more private rooms that lie beyond it, to her own chamber, or to the solar, that pleasant upper room set aside for the women of the house, lit by what windows the thick walls would allow, and warmed by its own fire. Here, away from the bustle of the hall, she passes the gentler part of her day among her gentlewomen. And here we find her at the work for which we most often picture her, the work of the needle and the thread. It is true that she did spin and weave and sew, but we should not imagine this as idle ornament, for the making of cloth and clothing was real and necessary labour, and a great deal of what clothed and furnished the castle came from the hands of its women. They spun thread from wool and flax upon the distaff and the spindle. They wove and they cut and they stitched, mending the household's linen and fashioning its garments. And at this useful labour the lady worked alongside her women, her hands as busy as theirs. For to be idle was held a sin and a shame, even in the greatest of ladies. But the finest of her needlework rose far above mere mending into something near to art. For the embroidery of these women was prized across the whole of Europe. With needles of bone and threads of coloured silk and gold, they worked pictures and patterns of astonishing richness, flowers and beasts and saints and scenes from Holy Story, upon altar cloths and vestments for the chapel, upon hangings for the walls, upon the very clothes they wore. The work was painstaking beyond our patience. A single fine piece, the labour of months or even years. The eyes strained and the fingers cramped over the close and shining stitches, and the results were treasured like jewels. Given as gifts to kings and churches, carried in dowries, handed down through families. To sit at such work in the afternoon light, the silks glowing in her lap and her women murmuring about her, was for the noblewoman both a duty and a deep pleasure, one of the quiet satisfactions of a life otherwise so full of care. And the beauty her hands made in those long afternoons has, in some few precious cases, outlasted the very castle in which she sat, surviving the centuries to glow at us still from behind glass. There was one branch of this art in which the women of England stood supreme above all others, and it is worth dwelling on, for in it their patience and their skill found their most lasting expression. So renowned was the work of English hands that it was sought across the courts and cathedrals of distant lands, ordered by popes and princes who would pay enormous sums for it, and it travelled as a treasure to churches that lay 1,000 miles from the chambers where it was stitched. Working with needles upon fine linen and silk, with threads of coloured silk and drawn gold and silver, and sometimes with little seed pearls and jewels, the women wrought pictures of astonishing richness and delicacy, saints and angels and scenes of Holy Story, set in frames of leaf and flower, and traced in lines of gold, glowing from the cloth with a brilliance that could rival the painted page or the window of stained glass. A single vestment, a cope or a chasuble for some mighty church, might be the work of several women over several years. Every figure and every fold built up stitch by tiny stitch in a discipline of the eye and the hand that we can scarcely imagine. It was demanding work, this fine embroidery, and it took a terrible toll, for the close labour over the gold and the silk strained the eyes and cramped the fingers. And a woman who gave her life to it might be half blind before her time. Yet it was loved as well as laboured at, for it was among the few arts in which a woman might create something of lasting beauty and lasting worth, a thing to be treasured and admired long after her hands were dust. The pieces these women made were valued like jewels and treated as treasures, given as gifts to kings and churches, listed with care in the wills of the great, carried as precious things in the dowries of brides, handed down through families as heirlooms. To make such beauty was a real and a rare satisfaction in a world so largely given over to the service of others, a way of leaving something of herself behind. And she at her frame in the afternoon light was an artist as truly as any painter, though the world has too often forgotten it. Nor was it only the small and precious pieces that came from the women's hands, for the clothing of the whole castle in fabric was largely their work and their care. The hangings that warmed and adorned the cold stone walls, the covers and cushions and bed curtains that softened the hard rooms, the banners and the heraldic stuffs that proclaimed the family's pride, all were made and mended and kept by the lady and her gentlewomen. In a world without the cheap and plentiful cloth we take for granted, where every thread was spun and every web was woven by hand, the making and keeping of textiles was a labour without end, and it fell upon the women of the house. So her needle served at once the highest purpose and the humblest working masterpieces for the altar and mending sheets for the beds. And in both she practiced a craft that was at the very centre of a woman's life, and that has left us, in its rare survivors, some of the most beautiful things the age produced. We should not leave the picture of the mistress in her chamber without saying something of her schooling, for the noblewoman of this age was very often a reader, and the realm of books was more open to her than we might suppose, though it had its clear limits. Most ladies of rank could read, taught to read in childhood as part of the polishing of a gentlewoman, and the page was among the real pleasures and real resources of their lives. They turned most of all to their own tongue and to the French that was the language of courtly culture, devouring the romances and the tales that were the favourite literature of their class, and they turned, too, to the devotional works that fed their faith, the Psalters and the books of hours and the lives of the saints, finding in them both the guidance of their souls and the quiet solace of the page. For a woman whose existence was so bounded, a written page was a door into other lives, into story and wonder and holy contemplation. And the lady who had her schooling held a key to riches that the unlettered could never know. There were limits, though, to a woman's learning, set by the customs of an age that reserved the higher reaches of knowledge largely to men. The deep learning of the clerks, the Latin scholarship of the schools and the universities, was for the most part closed to women who were not sent to those places of study and were rarely given that weightier education. A girl might learn enough Latin to follow her prayers, but the high country of learned books was, with rare exceptions, beyond her reach. And the forming of words was a separate skill from reading, less commonly taught and less often practiced, so that many a lady who read with ease would speak her missives to a clerk rather than set down the words in her own hand. Yet within these bounds there was real attainment, and some women went far beyond the common measure, becoming genuinely lettered, keeping volumes, even composing them. And the rich patronesses who commissioned and treasured the beautiful volumes of the age did as much as anyone to nourish the literature and the thought of their time. The lady's learning was not for herself alone, moreover, for she was very often the first teacher of her young, and through her a love of the page and the truths of faith passed to the next generation. In the years before they were sent away to be fostered, it was often the mother who taught the little ones their first reading and their first prayers, who set them on the path of learning and of devotion, who gave them, in the nursery and the chamber, the beginnings of all they would learn. So her love of letters rippled outward into the souls of her children and the culture of her house, and the quiet hours she spent over her own pages bore fruit in the learning of those who came after her. To see her so, then, the book open in her lap and her children perhaps at her knee, is to see not an idle ornament, but a keeper and a passer-on of the precious things of the mind, doing in her chamber a labour as real, in its way, as any she did in her hall. The afternoon in the chamber was not given over to the needle alone, for a noble lady was a woman of accomplishments, schooled from girlhood in the graces that befitted her rank, and these too filled her gentler hours. She could very likely read, in her own tongue, and perhaps a little in the Latin of the church, and reading was among the chief delights of the chamber, where the women would gather to hear the tales of the age read aloud, the long romances of knights and ladies and quests and enchantments that this age loved above all stories. She knew music, and could sing and play upon the harp or the lute or the psaltery, filling the chamber with sweet sound on a winter evening. She could dance the stately measures of the hall, an art as carefully taught as any. And she might pass an hour at chess or tables, the games of skill that were thought fit for noble minds. These accomplishments were not mere pastimes, but the very marks of her station, the things that distinguished a lady from a common woman, and they had been drilled into her through all her girlhood, often in the household of some other great family to which she had been sent as a child to learn the ways of the world. To be a lady was to be, in this sense, a work of art herself, shaped and polished from infancy into a creature of grace, fit to adorn a court and charm a hall. Yet, for all the hours she spent within doors, this was no caged and indoor creature, and one of the keenest pleasures of her life carried her out beyond the walls and into the open air. For the noblewoman of this age rode and hunted with the best. Hunting was among the chief joys and chief occupations of the whole nobility, men and women alike, and a noblewoman was very often a bold and a skilled rider, at home in the saddle, ready to ride out across her lord's broad lands in pursuit of the deer. She might join the wide hunts that swept through the forests after the stag and the boar, riding hard among the hounds and the horns and the shouting, or she might take her gentler sport with the hawk, in that most elegant of all the noble arts, the art of falconry. To ride out on a fresh morning with a hooded falcon upon her gloved wrist, to cast the bird up into the wide sky and watch it climb and stoop upon its quarry, was a delight reserved for the very highest, for the keeping of such birds was costly and their rank was nicely ordered, each degree of person matched to its proper bird. There was a freedom in these hours out of doors that the lady knew at few other times, the wind in her face and a good horse beneath her and the wide country opening before her. A brief release from the walls and the watching and the endless cares of the house. Of all the sports that carried the mistress out into the open air, none was more loved or more fitting to her rank than falconry. The keeping and the flying of trained hawks, and it deserves a closer look, for it was an art of high refinement and one in which women were as skilled and as keen as men. To fly a falcon was the very badge of nobility, so much so that the birds themselves were ranked, by custom, according to the degree of their owners. This one proper to a king, and that to an earl, and another. A small and a swift and a lovely one, held especially the bird of a lady. These hawks were no mere tools, but treasured companions, kept in the mews with the greatest care, fed and tended and watched over like the precious things they were. Each worth a small fortune, and each beloved in its own right. The training of them was a slow and a patient art. The winning of a wild creature to the hand by gentleness and skill, teaching it to know its keeper, to come to the lure, to sit hooded and calm upon the wrist and to fly and return. And a lady who had manned and trained her own falcon knew a closeness with it that was among the dearest of her days. To ride out with the falcons on a fair morning was a delight of a peculiar and an elegant kind. The lady would carry her hawk upon her gloved fist, hooded and belled, its little leather jesses held in her fingers, and at the right moment she would slip the hood and cast it up, and watch the creature mount into the sky on beating wings, climb until it was a speck against the clouds, and then fold and stoop like a falling stone upon its quarry. There was beauty in it, and a fierce excitement, and a freedom in the wide open fields and the racing of the heart as the bird flew. And there was companionship too, for the chase with hawks was a sport done in company. Ladies and gentlemen, riding out together in the bright air, far from the close walls and the watching eyes of the castle. It was among the very few pursuits in which a woman might compete on equal terms with men, matching her skill and her falcon against theirs, and many a noblewoman was famed for her mastery of it. To see her so, mounted and gloved with her hawk upon her wrist and the wind in her veil, is to see the noblewoman at her freest and her happiest. Mistress for an hour, not of a household, but of the open sky. If the flying of hawks was the most elegant of the field sports, the hunting of the deer was the grandest and the dearest. A passion that gripped the whole nobility and filled a large part of their leisure, and in it she took a keen and a practised part. The sport was no casual pastime, but an art hedged about with elaborate law and ceremony, with its own language and its own deep traditions, known and loved by every person of rank. The grandest of its forms was the pursuit of the stag by running hounds across the open country, a long and a thrilling chase in which the hunters rode hard behind the pack as it drove its quarry down through forest and field, the horns calling, the hounds giving tongue, the whole company strung out in headlong pursuit across the miles. There was the boar besides, a fiercer and a more dangerous quarry that could turn and kill, hunted with a special courage, and there were the lesser beasts pursued in their seasons, the whole wild harvest of the forest that the nobility guarded so jealously in their parks and chases. The lady rode to the hunt as boldly as any, for she had ridden from her girlhood and was at home in the saddle, and she pressed after the running pack across the country with skill and delight. Hunting was one of the few sports in which she could share fully in the doings of the men, riding among them through the long run, in at the death, sharing in the triumph and the right of the kill. And there is good evidence that the women of this age loved it as keenly as their husbands, and kept up as hard. Around it had grown a whole ceremony, observed with care, the gathering before the chase, the casting of the hounds, the stages of the run, and at the end the formal breaking of the deer. The ancient rite by which the carcass was divided, and the pack rewarded with their portion, each step done in its proper order and its proper way. To know this law, to sit a horse well, to carry oneself with skill and courage in the field, was a part of noble accomplishment, and the lady was schooled in it, as in all the other arts of her rank. Beyond the thrill and the ceremony, the hunt served deeper purposes in the life of the nobility, and they help explain the passion it inspired. It was sport, certainly, and a glorious one, but it was also a school of horsemanship and hardihood, a training of the body and the nerve that fitted the noble for the harder business of war. It was a source of food, the venison that graced the high tables, a prize of the field, and it was a social occasion of the first rank, a gathering of the high-born in the open air, full of company and display and shared excitement. For the noblewoman it was, above all, a freedom and a joy, one of the times when she escaped the walls and the cares of her house to ride out under the open sky in the thrilling pursuit, mistress of her horse and sharer in the oldest sport of her kind. To picture her so, riding hard among the dogs and the horns, with the wind in her face and the chase before her, is to see one of the brightest and most vigorous faces of her life, the bold and capable horsewoman who was every bit the equal, in the field, of the men who rode beside her. Closer to home there was the garden too, that small green refuge within or beside the castle walls, where she might walk in the milder seasons among the herbs and the flowers. These gardens were lovingly made and tended, set with sweet-smelling plants and healing herbs, with turfed seats and trained roses and perhaps a little fountain, a place apart from the harshness of the world where a woman might take the air, say her prayers, meet her friends, or sit at her sewing in the sun. The herbs that grew there were not for beauty alone, but for use, for from them came the medicines with which the lady physicked her household, and she knew their virtues as a modern woman knows the contents of a medicine chest. To walk in such a garden on a warm afternoon, the bees among the flowers and the high walls keeping out the wider world, was one of the small and perfect pleasures of her world, a moment of peace stolen from a day otherwise given wholly to others. In these gentler hours, between the labour of the morning and the gathering of the evening, we glimpse her at something nearer to rest, and see that her hard and bounded life held real beauty in it too, and real delight. This green retreat deserves a closer look, for it was made with real art and held a meaning beyond its beauty. Within its bounds, the gardeners set out the plants in trim beds and raised them on turfed banks, trained sweetbriar and vine over wooden frames to make shade, sowed the short grass thick with daisies and violets and periwinkle, and tended the lilies and the roses that were loved above all other flowers. There was often a measure of running water, channeled into a little pool or a fountain, prized for its coolness and its music. And there were birds, kept or wild, to sing among the branches. The whole was a work of patience and care, renewed season by season, a deliberate making of a small perfection in the midst of a rough world, and it stood as the very picture of order and sweetness that the lady was meant to embody. But it was for use as much as for pleasure, for among the beds grew the herbs from which she made the physic of her household. And here we come to one of her most important and least remembered roles, that of healer. There were few physicians in that age, and almost none within reach of a country castle, and so the care of the sick fell upon the lady, who was expected to know the healing virtues of plants, and to brew from them the remedies that were the only medicine her people would ever see. From those beds she made the salves and the syrups and the soothing drinks with which she treated the fevers and the wounds and the sicknesses of her household and her tenants, drawing on a deep traditional lore of what each plant could do, passed down from woman to woman and gathered in the herbals she might keep. She dressed wounds, set the simple bone, eased the pains of the sick, tended the dying, and brought what comfort and what cure the knowledge of her age could offer, the nearest thing to a doctor that the whole community possessed. So that green close was at once her pleasure ground and her dispensary, a place of beauty and a place of work, and it bound together two of the truest aspects of her life, the love of order and loveliness and the duty of care. The enclosed close held, too, a deeper meaning for the people of that age, for it was an old and a cherished image of purity and of the Virgin herself, the secret garden shut against the world, and a lady walking among her flowers was moving in a space rich with sacred meaning as well as with sweet scent. To picture her there on a summer afternoon, moving among the roses and the healing herbs with her women about her and her children at play upon the grass, is to glimpse the gentlest and the most peaceful face of her hard world, the small walled paradise in which, for a little while, the cares of the great house and the dangers of the violent age were shut outside the gate. To understand this woman fully, we must turn from the business of her day to the deeper currents that ran beneath it, and the first and the deepest of these was her marriage, for it was marriage that had made her what she was, and marriage that shaped the whole course of her life. We who choose our own partners for love can scarcely imagine how differently such things were ordered then. For a noble marriage was not a matter of the heart at all, but a matter of land and blood and alliance, a treaty struck between two families for their mutual advantage. Our Lady did not choose her husband, and very likely barely knew him before she was given to him. The match was made for her, while she was still a girl, by her father and his. Two men weighing acres and titles and the strengthening of their houses, with her own wishes counting for little or nothing in the reckoning. Children were promised to one another, while they were still children, sometimes betrothed at 7 years old, sometimes pledged in the cradle when the families were great enough to make it worth their while, and a girl might find herself married, while still little more than a child, to a man she had met but once, or to a husband older than her own father. What the bride brought to this bargain was her dowry, the portion of money or land her family settled upon the match, and what she received in return was her dower, the lands assigned to her keeping should her husband die before her and leave her a widow. These were the true substance of the marriage, the things the fathers haggled over. And once the bargain was sealed and the vows were spoken at the church door, the girl passed out of her father's keeping and into her husband's, to begin the existence we have been following. Her first and her greatest duty in that life was a hard and a perilous one, for she was married above all to bear children, to give her husband the heirs who would carry on his name and his blood and inherit his lands. The marriage bed was, in this sense, a matter of duty before it was ever a matter of affection, the means by which the whole purpose of the union was to be fulfilled, and a wife who failed to bear or who bore only daughters where sons were wanted, knew herself to have failed in the very thing for which she had been married. It was a hard foundation for a life, this bargain struck over her head, and yet from it, often enough, true affection grew. As two strangers bound together for life learned in time to value and even to love one another. We have spoken of how marriages were arranged and of how they were lived, but the marriage day itself, when two lives were bound together, was an event of its own, a great occasion of ceremony and feasting that marked the joining of two houses before the eyes of all. For a marriage of consequence was no private matter, but a public act, the sealing of an alliance, and it was celebrated with all the splendour the families could command. The marriage itself was solemnized by the custom of the age, at the door of the church rather than within it. There, before the gathered company, the vows were exchanged, and the ring was given, and the dower was named, in the sight of all, and only then did the bridal party pass inside for the nuptial mass. The bride was arrayed in the finest her family could provide, robed and jewelled for the greatest day of her life, the centre of all eyes, and around the couple gathered the two families and their followings, come to witness the binding of their houses and to share in the celebration. After the solemn part came the joyful, the marriage feast, which might be the grandest entertainment a family ever mounted, a banquet of many courses and much display, with music and dancing and merriment that could go on for days. For the day was a chance to show the wealth and the standing of both houses, to honour the alliance with magnificence, and no expense was spared that could be afforded. The hall blazed, the tables groaned, the guests feasted and danced, and the union of the two families was proclaimed to the land entire in a festival of plenty. There were gifts given and received, there was the gathering of kin from far and wide, there was all the noise and colour and joy of the highest of social occasions, and at the heart of it stood the bride and the groom. Often little more than strangers, sometimes very young, beginning before this great company the shared life that had been arranged for them. For the bride in particular, the day was a passage of deep moment, for it marked her leaving of one life and her entering upon another. She passed on that day out of her father's house and authority and into her husband's, often leaving the family and the home she had known to go and live among her husband's people in his hall as the mistress of his estate. And for a girl who might be very young, this could be a wrenching as well as a joyful day, the beginning of her real existence as a woman and the end of her girlhood at a single stroke. The wedding night that followed, hedged about with its own customs and blessings, completed the binding, for a marriage was made final only in its consummation. And so, amid feasting and ceremony and the joining of two proud houses, the new-made wife began the life we have followed through its long day, the running of a household, the bearing of heirs, the weighty business of a noblewoman's existence, launched upon it by the splendid and the solemn rite of her wedding. We have seen how coldly marriages were made, struck as bargains over land between two fathers with never a word of the heart, but it would be wrong to leave the matter there. For the marriage that began as a treaty had then to be lived year upon year, and the living of it was a far more various and a far more human thing than the making of it. Two strangers joined for life by the will of others had now to make a life together, and what they made of it depended upon themselves, upon their tempers and their fortunes, and the slow work of the years. Sometimes, no doubt, it remained cold to the end. Two people bound together who never came to care for one another, enduring rather than sharing their long companionship. But very often, perhaps more often than not, something warmer grew between them. The affection and the trust and the deep familiarity that the living of a whole life can breed, until the marriage made for land became, in time, a marriage of real and settled love. For there was much to draw a husband and wife together, once the bargain was struck and the knot tied. They held, above all, a common enterprise, the fortunes of their house, the raising of their children, the guarding and the increasing of the family's holdings and standing. And in that joint work, the wife was no idle partner, but her husband's deputy and ally, the keeper of his home, the guardian of his interests in his absence, the mother of his heirs. A wise husband valued such a partner and leaned upon her, took her counsel, trusted her with his affairs. And the partnership of a noble marriage could be a true and an equal thing within its bounds. Two souls labouring together at the common business of their existence. The children drew them close, the long years drew them close, the triumphs and the griefs drew them close, and many a couple who had come together as strangers ended as the dearest of companions, twined together like two trees planted side by side. Yet we must not paint it all in rosy colours, for the same system that could grow into love could also trap a woman in misery. And there was little she could do if her lot fell hard. A woman whose husband proved cruel, or cold, or brutal, had small escape, for the marriage was for life, and the law and the faith tied her to him. She could not leave, could rarely complain, and must make what peace she could with the man chosen for her. She held real influence, often, over a husband who respected her, and could work her will through patience and persuasion where she could not command. But where she was unlucky in the man, she might pass her whole life in a quiet unhappiness from which there was no door. So the reality of marriage ran the whole range of human possibility, from cold endurance through workmanlike partnership to deep and lasting love, and a woman's happiness hung, in the end, upon the throw of the dice that had chosen her husband for her. A throw in which she herself had had no say at all. It is against this hard, practical world of arranged marriage that we must set the strange and beautiful dream that haunted the same age, the dream the poets called courtly devotion. For the two stood in the sharpest contrast. While the marriages of the great were settled like treaties, with never a word of the heart, the songs and the stories of the age told of a wholly different passion, an adoration, pure and aching, in which a knight gave his whole soul to the service of a lady, worshipping her from afar, performing brave deeds in her honour, asking nothing and enduring all for the least sign of her favour. This was the worship sung by the wandering poets in the halls of the mighty, the longing of the romances that the ladies heard read aloud in their chambers, an ideal of refined and selfless passion, utterly unlike the bargains by which real marriages were made. It was, in part, a kind of game, an elegant fiction played out at court, a code of manners that taught men to honour and serve women, and women to inspire and reward them. And it gave to the noblewoman, hemmed in as she was by duty, a strange and a heady power. For in the world of the song, she was not a piece of property to be traded, but a queen to be worshipped. Yet the dream had its shadow and its danger, for the passion the poets praised was very often an attachment outside marriage, the devotion of a knight to a lady who was another man's wife. And where such a yearning passed from song into life, it could bring ruin. A wife's honour in this age was a thing fiercely guarded, for upon it depended the certainty of her husband's bloodline, the surety that his heirs were truly his. And a woman who strayed, or was even thought to have strayed, might be cast off, shut away, or worse, while the man who had tempted her might pay with his life. So the mistress walked a narrow line between the beautiful fiction and the deadly fact, free to be worshipped in the safe play of the court, yet bound, on pain of disgrace, to a perfect faithfulness in the world outside it. The romance of courtly devotion was a window through which she might glimpse a world of feeling and freedom denied her in the cold arithmetic of her marriage. But it was a window only, and to climb through it was to fall. The vision of courtly love did not live in the air alone. It lived in song and story, in a whole literature of romance that filled the leisure of the noble hall and shaped the way the great pictured devotion and honour and themselves. When she sat at her needle in the afternoon, or gathered with her women of an evening by the fire, it was very often to the sound of these tales that the hours passed, read aloud or sung by a minstrel or recited from memory. The winding romances of knights and ladies and quests and marvels that were the favourite reading of her kind. They told of brave knights who rode out in search of adventure, of perilous quests and enchanted forests and monsters overcome, and above all of the heart, the devotion of a knight to his lady, a passion that drove him to great deeds and sustained him through every trial, and they set before the listening hall an ideal of conduct, a vision of how the noble ought to live and serve and bear themselves. That was half a fancy and half a code to live by. This was the craft, above all, of the poets and singers who wandered between the noble courts, the makers of songs who sang of love in the new and tender manner that had been born in the warm south and spread across the courts of the great. They sang of a passion that was a kind of worship. The knight bound to the service of a lady set high above him, often a married lady beyond his reach, whom he adored from afar and served with his every deed, asking nothing and enduring all. It was a strange and a lovely idea, this exaltation of woman into an object of devotion, so unlike the hard truth of arranged marriage and a wife's subjection. And it gave to the ladies of the hall a power and a glory in the realm of the imagination that they were denied in the realm of fact. Within the song, the lady was supreme, the giver of joy or despair, the worshipped mistress of her knight's whole soul, and a noblewoman who in life was a piece traded between two fathers, might, in the world of romance, reign as a queen over the heart of the bravest of men. We should not think these stories merely idle, for they did real work in their day, shaping manners and feeding dreams and giving the hard lives of the greater glamour and a meaning. The code of this courtly devotion taught the rough fighting men of that age to bridle their manners in the presence of women, to value gentleness and courtesy and service, to make of devotion an art and a discipline. And it gave to the women, hemmed in as they were, a glimpse of an existence in which they were honoured and adored rather than ruled and used. It was a fancy, and like all fancies it could mislead, luring the unwary toward the real perils of forbidden passion. But it was a lovely dream, and it shines through the literature of the age, like sunlight through coloured glass. The grand compensating fancy of an age whose marriages were made of cold iron. To hear those old romances read in a firelit hall was to be carried, for an hour, into a brighter and a kinder life than the one in which the listeners actually dwelt. Nowhere did the dream of chivalry and the truth of noble life come together more brilliantly than at the tourney, that grand spectacle of arms and pageantry which was among the chief delights of the noble world, and in which the noblewoman had a starring part to play. A tourney was a gathering of knights to display their skill at arms in mock battle and in the joust, two riders thundering toward one another with levelled lances. But it was far more than a trial of strength, for it was a festival, a pageant, a social occasion of the first rank, drawing the nobility from miles around to watch and to be seen. And the ladies were at the very heart of it, not as idle bystanders, but as the honoured focus of the display, seated in the stands in their finest array. The bright audience for whose admiration the knights contended, for the contest was bound up with the whole code of courtly love, and a knight rode, in the fiction of the day, for the honour of his lady, a striving not only for the prize, but for her favour and her glory. The customs that bound her into the spectacle were charming and meaningful. A champion might wear into the lists a favour given him by his lady, a sleeve or a scarf or a ribbon, a token worn upon his helm or his arm to declare whose champion he was and to carry her honour into the fray. A lady might be chosen as the queen of the tournament, presiding over the whole event, bestowing the prize upon the victor with her own hand, the crowning grace of the day, and all the pageantry of the thing. The painted shields and the bright banners and the heralds crying the names and the deeds of the riders, made of the day a feast for the eye and a celebration of the noble class entire, in which the ladies shone as brightly as the knights. It was display and flirtation and high ceremony all at once. The courtly ideal made flesh for a few glittering days. And for the lady it was among the rare occasions when she was not the manager and the labourer, but the adored and the admired. Yet beneath the pageantry ran a vein of real danger, for the sport was no mere game. The lances were sometimes sharp, and the blows were real, and men were hurt and even killed in the contests, fought for the lady's favour. There was a seriousness beneath the glitter, a reminder that this was a warrior society at play, rehearsing the violence that was its true business, and she who gave her favour to a champion might watch him fall, might see the sport turn to tragedy before her eyes. But for the most part, the tourney was joy and splendour, crowned by the feasting and the dancing that followed it, when the hall blazed and the music played and the day's heroes were honoured, and the ladies who had watched from the stands now led the revels. It was the noble life at its most brilliant, the hard realities of arms and rank dissolved for a while into beauty and ceremony and delight, and at the centre of that brilliance, giving it meaning and grace, were the ladies, for whose honour the bright, dangerous game was played. And so we come to the gravest and the most defining passage of her life, the bearing of children, which was at once the purpose of her existence and the sharpest peril of it. For childbirth in this age was a deadly business, the single most dangerous thing that the women of any rank were called upon to do, and a great many of them died in the doing of it. Even the highest, even those tended by the ablest midwives the age could provide. A noblewoman might be brought to bed many times across her life, carrying and bearing child after child through all her fruitful years, and at every one of those confinements she walked, knowingly, into the shadow of death. And she knew, as she felt each new life quicken within her, that this might be the time she did not survive. When her hour drew near, she withdrew into a world apart, the lying-in chamber, a room made ready for the birth, and sealed against the outside, its windows shuttered and its hangings drawn. Kept warm and dim and quiet. Into that chamber no man might come, not even her husband, for the bearing of children was wholly the business of women. She was attended only by the midwife and by her gentlewomen and female kin, who gathered about her to help and to comfort and to pray. In that close and shadowed room, through the long hours of her labour, the mistress fought her solitary battle, and faith was her chief companion in it. The women about her would call upon the saint who guarded mothers in their travail, would lay holy relics or a blessed girdle upon her, would read aloud the story of deliverance and breathe its prayers over her, doing what the age knew how to do, to carry her safely through. And if she came through it, if the child was born living and she herself survived, there was rejoicing through the household and a hush of relief among the women who had watched with her, and the long-held breath of the whole castle was let go. Then, in the course of nature and after the proper season of recovery, the same passage would open before her again, as it would open many times across her years. To bear the heirs of a noble house was the very reason she had been married, and she paid for it again and again with her own life set upon the table. And in this, more than in anything, we see how high a price the women of that golden age were made to pay for their golden place in it. The bearing of a child was the heaviest and most perilous labour of a woman's life, and the age had wrapped it about with ritual and custom, a whole body of practice that governed the lady's passage through her hour of danger. As her time drew near, she would withdraw from the ordinary life of the household into the seclusion of the lying-in chamber. A room made ready for the birth and for the weeks that would follow it, and the preparing of that room followed rules as old as memory. The windows were shuttered, and the keyholes sometimes stopped. The walls were hung with the richest cloths the house could provide, and a great fire was kept burning. For the belief of the age held that the labouring woman and her newborn must be kept warm and dim and close, shut away from cold air and bright light and the gaze of the household. Into this warm and shadowed chamber she retired to await her hour, and from the moment she entered it, she passed into a realm entirely of women. For the birth itself was wholly the business of the female sex, and no man crossed the threshold of that room, not the physician, not the priest, not the husband whose child was being born. The lady was attended by the midwife, a woman of skill and experience, whose art was the safe delivery of children, and by her gentlewomen and her female kin and neighbours, who gathered to help and to comfort, and above all to pray. For prayer and the help of heaven were the chief defences against the terror of the hour, and the chamber was full of holy things pressed into service against the danger, relics borrowed from a church, a blessed candle, the girdle of a saint laid upon the labouring body, and the story of the saint who guarded mothers read aloud to give heart and hope. There was little enough that the skill of the age could do if things went hard, and women and children died in great numbers in that chamber, despite every care, and so they leaned upon their faith and their saints and one another. And the lady fought her long battle in the company of women, with heaven invoked at every breath. If she came through it, there remained the slow passage back into ordinary existence, governed by its own ritual. For a time after the birth she kept to her chamber, still lying in among her women, recovering her strength, while the household waited and the child was given to its nurse. And then at last came the day of her churching, the ceremony by which she returned to the church to give thanks for her deliverance and to be welcomed back, blessed and purified among the people of the parish. It was a day of quiet joy and solemn thanksgiving, marking the safe end of the long ordeal, and it restored her to her place among others after the strange set-apart weeks of the birth. Then her ordinary life resumed, until in the course of nature the whole passage began again, the seclusion and the danger and the long return, as many times as her body was made to bear it. To understand a medieval woman is to understand that she walked this perilous road again and again across her fruitful years, and that each journey into the lying-in chamber was a journey into real danger, undertaken with courage and borne with faith. If the bearing of children was the purpose of her marriage, the raising of them was a stranger business than we might suppose. For the noble children of this age were reared in a manner that would seem cold and distant to us, hedged about with ceremony and often passed from hand to hand. The newborn heir was given, as we have seen, not to its mother's breast, but to a wet nurse, a healthy woman engaged to suckle the child in the mother's stead, so that the mistress might be free to bear again the sooner. And from there the child passed into the care of a nursery of servants, rockers and nurses and attendants, who tended its every need under her distant oversight. She loved her children by every sign and grieved bitterly when she lost them, as she so often did. But the daily closeness of mother and child that we take for granted was not the way of her world, and her sons and daughters were raised more by servants than by her own hands, in their own establishment within the household, seen by their mother on appointed occasions, rather than gathered always about her knee. And then, while they were still children, they were very often parted from her altogether, for it was the custom of this age to foster out the children of the nobility, to place them to be reared in some other noble household than their own. A boy of 7 or so might be dispatched to the castle of a powerful lord, sent there to serve as a page and learn the arts of war and courtesy. To grow toward knighthood far from his mother's sight, a girl might be placed in the same way in the household of some other lady, to learn the running of a house and the graces of her rank, and very often to be matched there with a husband. So the lady, who had borne her children in such peril and reared them through their infancy, would in time give them up to be raised by others, even as she herself had once been given up by her own mother and sent as a girl to a strange house far away. It seems a hard thing to us, this parting with children, and no doubt it was felt as a sorrow. But it was the universal way of that age, the means by which the young were trained and bound and married into the wide web of the nobility, and a mother bore it as she bore so much else, as simply the way of things. Before the noble child was old enough to be sent away into the wide world of fostering, it passed its earliest years in a sphere of its own, and that small warm kingdom of infants and women deserves a glance. For there every great life began. The newborn of a noble house came into a round of careful custom. It was washed and swaddled, wrapped firmly in bands of cloth in the belief that this would help its soft limbs grow straight and strong, and laid in a cradle to be rocked by the women whose task it was. There it lived its first months and years, in the care of its nurse and the rockers and attendants set over it, fed and tended and watched over, while the noblewoman, freed by the wet nurse from the daily labour of it, went about the business of her house and prepared, in time, to bear again. The nursery was a small commonwealth of women and children, set a little apart within the great household, with its own rhythms of feeding and sleeping, and the slow miraculous unfolding of a new life. It was not, for all the distance of noble parenting, a loveless or a joyless place, for the children of the mighty were cherished and played with, and delighted in, like children everywhere. They had their toys, the simple beloved playthings of childhood that have changed so little across the centuries, dolls and hobby horses, balls and tops and whistles, little figures and miniature things made for small hands, and they had their games and their songs and their play, filling those rooms with the noise and laughter of the very young. As the children grew, their teaching began, gently at first, the learning of manners and prayers and letters, the shaping of the small person toward the grown one it was meant to become. And she, for all that others did the daily work, watched over this unfolding, took her pleasure in her children, and grieved as any parent would when one of them faltered, for over the whole bright kingdom of childhood there hung always a shadow, the shadow of the terrible mortality that carried off so many children before they were grown. It was the hard truth of that age that a great many infants died, of sickness and accident, and the frailty of the very young, so that a woman might bear many children and raise only a few to adulthood, and might stand more than once beside a small grave. They knew this, the parents of that world, and braced themselves against it, and yet the love was not the less for the danger, nor the sorrow the less when it came. The letters and the records show us plainly how deeply these losses were felt, for all that they were common. The nursery, then, was a place of love and laughter, lived always in the knowledge of loss. The cradle and the grave never far apart. And the woman who watched her little ones at play in it knew, in the back of her heart, how many might not be spared to her. It is a sober note on which to leave that warm small world, but a true one. And it tells us much about the courage with which the women of that age gave and tended, and so often gave up the children they had borne in such peril. The custom of fostering reached deep into the bonds of the nobility, and it is worth pausing on what it meant beyond the simple sending of a child from one roof to another. To take in the son or daughter of another house was to enter into a kind of kinship with that house, a tie of trust and obligation that bound the two families as surely as a marriage might. The foster parents stood almost as second parents to the child, answerable for its rearing, and the bond formed in those years could last a lifetime. A great lord might gather about him a whole company of the sons of his friends and allies and lesser men, rearing them in his household. And in doing so, he wove a web of loyalty that would serve him and his heirs for a generation. For the boys raised at his board would carry their affection and their allegiance into their own manhood. So fostering was not only a schooling, but a binding, a means by which the scattered houses of the nobility were knit together, child by child, into a single great fabric of kinship and service. For the child placed out in this way, the new household became a school of the whole art of being noble. A boy began at the bottom, waiting at table and running errands and tending his lord, and rose by degrees through the duties of a page and then a squire, learning all the while to ride and to bear arms, to carry himself with courtesy, to serve and to command. And through these years of service he made the friendships and earned the notice that might shape his whole future. A girl set among the gentlewomen of a noble household learned by daily example the bearing and the skills her own house would one day demand of her, and made there the connections that might lead to a good marriage. It was a hard apprenticeship, begun young and far from home, and it asked of the child an early independence. But it was also the surest road into the world of the mighty, and the child who served well in a powerful house had taken the first long step toward a place of its own within it. It seems a hard system to us, this giving up of young children, and we should not pretend that it was painless. For the letters and the records of the age show us parents who loved their children dearly and grieved for them bitterly when they died, as so many did. But it was the universal way of that world, accepted as simply the manner in which the young were raised and trained and launched into their lives, and both mother and child bore it, as they bore the other hard necessities of their age. The love was real, for all the distance. The grief at a child's death was real, but the daily, hourly closeness of mother and child that we hold so dear was not the medieval way, and the children of the great were raised, from the cradle to the threshold of adulthood, more by nurses and tutors and foster families than by their own mothers. To understand the lady is to understand that she gave her children life at the risk of her own, and then, very often, gave them up, and that this double sacrifice was simply the shape that motherhood took in her world. Among the duties and the consolations of her religious existence, one carried the mistress out of her castle and onto the open road, and that was pilgrimage. The holy journey to some sacred shrine that was among the rare adventures of a medieval life. To go on pilgrimage was to travel, often over long and perilous ways, to the grave of some saint, or to some place made holy by miracle. There to pray, to give thanks, to seek healing for a sickness or pardon for a sin, to fulfill a vow made in some hour of fear or grief. The shrines drew pilgrims from every rank, the high lady and the humble peasant upon the same way, bound for the tomb of a martyr or the image of the Virgin that was said to work wonders. And the traveller returned with a badge of lead pinned to her hat or her cloak, the proof and the memory of where she had been. For a woman whose days were otherwise so bounded by the walls of her house, such a journey was a precious release, a holy reason to travel out into the wide country, to see strange towns and meet strange people and ride for days beneath the open sky. It was devotion and adventure both, a duty to the soul that was also a freedom for the body. And the women of this age took to the pilgrim ways in great numbers, finding in the journey to the shrine a liberty they could find in almost nothing else. But the way was not without its perils, for travel in this age was slow and hard and far from safe, and a pilgrim set out knowing she might meet with robbers, with foul weather, with sickness, with all the hazards of rough roads and rougher inns. She went, therefore, in company, joining with fellow wayfarers for safety and for fellowship, and the band of wayfarers upon the way, made up of every sort of person thrown together by a common goal, became a small world of its own, full of talk and tale-telling, and the easy companionship of the journey. There was a freedom in that company too, a loosening of the rigid bonds of rank and place. For on the way to the shrine, a high lady and a tradesman's wife might ride and talk together as they never would at home. And at the journey's end there waited the shrine itself, the tall church and the holy tomb, ablaze with candles and crowded with the faithful, where she might kneel at last in the presence of the saint she had come so far to seek, and pour out the prayer that had carried her all that long way. To have made such a journey was a thing remembered for a lifetime, a high point in a life of duty, and a story to be told by the fire for years to come. The shrines to which the pilgrim roads led were among the wonders of the age, and it is worth knowing something of the chief ones. For to set out for such a place was the dream of many a devout lady, and to have reached one was the achievement of a lifetime. Nearest to home for the women of England was the shrine of the murdered archbishop, who had been cut down in his own cathedral by the knights of an angry king, and whose tomb became, within a few years of his death, the most famous place of pilgrimage in the kingdom, drawing the sick and the sorrowful and the curious from every corner of the realm to seek his help and to marvel at his glittering tomb. There was the famed shrine of the Virgin in the east of England, called by some the Nazareth of the English, where a noble lady of old was said to have built a likeness of the house in which the angel had greeted Mary, and where pilgrims came in their thousands to honour the Mother of God. To journey to one of these was within the reach of many, a sacred adventure of a few weeks that brought a woman home with a badge upon her cloak and a tale to tell for the rest of her days. But for the boldest souls and the most devout, there were goals far off and far harder, travels of months or years across the whole of the known world. There was the resting place of an apostle in the far west of Spain, reached by long roads across the mountains, where pilgrims wore the badge of a scallop shell to show where they had been. There was the holy city of Rome, with the tombs of the apostles and the relics of 1,000 saints, to which the faithful streamed especially in the great years of pardon proclaimed by the popes. And beyond all these, the supreme and the most perilous goal of all, there was the Holy Land, the very ground where the Lord had walked and died, the road to which was the hardest and most dangerous a pilgrim could undertake. Across stormy seas and hostile lands, from which many never returned, to have reached the Holy Sepulchre and come safely home again was the crown of a pilgrim's life, a feat spoken of with awe, and there were ladies, hardy and devout beyond the common, who made even this tremendous voyage and lived to tell of it. Whatever the shrine, near or far, the pilgrim's purpose was the same: to come into the presence of the sacred, to pray where prayer was believed most powerful, to seek healing or pardon or the granting of some deep desire, and to fulfill the vows made in the dark hours of life. At the journey's end waited the tall church and the blazing shrine, the press of the faithful, the relics in their jewelled cases, the air thick with candle smoke and the hum of prayer. And there the lady knelt at last, after all her travelling, and poured out the petition that had carried her so far. To have made such a journey was to have done a mighty thing, a high point in a life of duty, remembered and recounted ever after. And the pilgrim badge she brought home, pinned to her hat or her gown, was the proud and humble proof that she, in her own person, had walked the sacred road and stood in the presence of the saint. In an age that offered women so few journeys and so little freedom, the pilgrimage was a door into the wider world, and the women of that age walked through it gladly. Whether upon pilgrimage or upon the ordinary business of her life, when the noblewoman left her castle, she entered a world of journeying that was slow and hard and often dangerous. Utterly unlike the easy movement we know, the roads of that age were poor things, mere tracks for the most part, deep in mud through the long wet months, rutted and broken and haunted in lonely places by robbers. And to ride them was a serious undertaking, planned with care and not lightly begun. The lady rode, most often, on horseback, for the horse was the chief means of going any distance, and a noblewoman was a practised rider from her girlhood. But for the very grand, or the old, or the sick, or the great lady travelling in state, there was the litter, or the chariot, a kind of covered wagon or curtained bed slung between horses, which spared the body the labour of riding, but jolted and lurched so over the rough roads that it was often the harder way to go. The lady did not travel alone or lightly, for a person of rank on the road moved, as a small army moves, with a whole train of attendants and baggage. About her rode her gentlewomen and her servants, and a guard of armed men for protection against the perils of the way. Behind came the carts and pack horses laden with the goods a noble traveller required, for she carried much with her, even her own bedding and plate and furnishings, since she could not count on finding such comforts at her journey's end. The pace of such a company was slow, a few miles in an hour, a day's hard travel covering a distance we would now think nothing of, and the nights upon the road were spent where shelter could be found, at the house of some friendly lord, or at a monastery whose duty it was to lodge travellers, or, at the worst, at some rough inn, for the high-born avoided the common inns where they could. So a journey of any length was a considerable enterprise, a thing of days or weeks, demanding planning and provision and courage. And it carried her out of the safe enclosure of her castle into the wide and risky world beyond. Yet for all its hardship, travel was woven through her existence, for the nobility were forever on the move, riding to court, visiting kin, attending the marriages and the funerals and the grand gatherings of their class, following the king, or simply moving with the household from one of the family's estates to another. The lady went with them, enduring the mud and the cold and the danger as the price of moving through her world, and seeing, in the course of her travels, far more of the country and its people than we might suppose a woman of her cloistered reputation ever saw. The road was hard, but it was also a window onto the wider world, and the lady who rode it knew her country, its towns and its shrines and its great houses, in a way that wove her into the whole life of her age. In an age without any swift means of sending word, the keeping of ties across distance was a slow and a precious art, and she was often at the heart of it. For much of the business and the news of a noble family passed by the written page, and the written packet was one she made constant use of. When her lord was away, as he so often was, it was by writing that she kept in touch with him, reporting on the state of his lands and his household, seeking his wishes, passing back and forth the news of the household and the wider world. And it was by the pen, too, that she conducted much of the business that fell to her, writing to officers and merchants and neighbours, to the high folk whose favour she sought, to the kin scattered across the land whose doings she must follow. The family letters of the Middle Ages that have come down to us show us their women as busy and capable correspondents, running estates and arranging marriages and pursuing lawsuits and pleading for favours, all through the patient sending of written words across the miles. The making and dispatching of a missive was itself a considerable business in that age. The lady might write with her own hand if she was lettered, or more often dictate to a clerk who set down her words in a fair script, and the finished sheet was folded and sealed with her own seal pressed into wax. That seal being the sign and the warrant of her authority, the proof that they were truly hers. Then it had to be carried, and there were no posts as we know them, only the messengers and servants who bore them by hand, riding the long and dangerous roads for days to deliver a single packet, so that news might take a week or more to pass between places we would now think close together. Word in such an age travelled at the pace of a horse, and a person might wait long and anxiously for tidings of a husband at the wars, of a child in a distant household, of the outcome of some matter on which everything depended. For all its slowness, this traffic of paper was a lifeline, binding together the scattered members of a great family and the far-flung pieces of a wide estate, and carrying across the miles the love and the business and the news that held a noble life together. Through her writing, the mistress reached out beyond the walls of her castle to manage her affairs and keep her ties, to comfort and command and inform, to be present on the page, where she could not be in person. The letters bring us closer to these women than almost anything else, for in them we hear their actual voices, shrewd and tender and forceful by turns, managing their husbands and their stewards and their children with a sure hand, and we see past the silent effigies on the tombs to the living, capable, determined women who wrote them. To read them is to be reminded that the lady was no mere ornament but an active force in the world, reaching out through the slow means of the pen to govern as much of her world as she could. Closer to home, woven through all her days, ran another religious duty that fell especially upon her, and that was charity, the care of the poor and the sick, who depended upon the noble house for their very lives. It was held the plain duty of the high-born, in this age, to give freely to those below them, and the lady was the hand through which much of that giving flowed. We have seen already how the leavings of her table went out to feed the needy who gathered at the gate, but her charity ran far deeper than scraps. She gave alms in money and in kind to the needy of the estate, clothed the ragged, fed the hungry in hard seasons, and nursed the sick with her own hands and her own medicines. For she was the nearest thing to a physician that the poor of her lands would ever know. She visited the dying, stood godmother to the children of her people, gave dowries to portionless girls, who could not else have married, and endowed, where she could, the chantries and almshouses by which her charity might outlive her. This was no idle sentiment, but a solemn obligation, bound up with her faith and her station alike. For she believed with her whole soul that the care she showed the needy in this life would be weighed in her favour in the next. There was, in all of this, a real and a daily kindness. Whatever we may think of the harsh world that made it necessary, for the mistress stood as the mother of her folk as well as of her children, the one to whom the whole community of the estate looked in its troubles. The sick man, the widow, the orphaned child, the old servant, past his work, all turned to the lady of the castle for help, and she gave it as her faith and her station required, binding the great house and the humble village together in a web of duty and dependence that held that world in its place. It was a kindness, shaped by the hard order of the age, given from high to low and never the other way, and it asked, in its turn, a deep and humble gratitude, but it was kindness for all that. Real bread to the hungry, and real care to the sick, and the lady who gave it well was loved by her people, and remembered and mourned. In her charity, as in so much else, we see the strange mingling of power and duty, of privilege and obligation, that made up the sum of her remarkable existence. There is a strange truth about the women of this age that we must not pass over, which is that the freest most of them ever became was in their widowhood, when the husband to whom they had been bound was dead and gone. While her lord lived, the noblewoman was subject to him in law and in custom, her property his to manage, her person under his authority. But when he died, a remarkable change came over her, standing for a widowed woman in the eyes of the law, a person in her own right at last, free to own property, to make contracts, to plead in court, to order her own affairs as no wife and no maid could do. She was entitled to her dower, that portion of her late husband's estate set aside to support her for the rest of her life, and upon this she might live in independence and dignity, the mistress now of her own holdings. Answerable to no man, many a widow of this age became a formidable figure, a proud dowager managing broad lands with a firm and a practised hand, holding her household together and guarding the inheritance of her children. wielding an authority she had never known while her husband lived. The very condition we should think the saddest, the loss of a husband, was in this hard world the gateway to a freedom a woman could find at no other time. Yet even this freedom had its limits and its dangers. For a wealthy relict was a prize, and the world would not always let her keep her liberty in peace. Her estates and her person were a temptation to ambitious men, and she might find herself pressed hard to wed again by her own kin who wished to use her, or by a powerful lord who coveted her holdings, or even by the king himself, who in some realms held the right to bestow a wealthy relict upon whatever follower he chose to reward. Against such pressure, a determined woman might hold out, and many did, clinging to the independence that widowhood had given them. Some took a solemn vow of chastity before a bishop, swearing never to wed again, and so set themselves beyond the reach of the suitors and lived out their days as their own mistresses, devout and free. Others chose to wed again for their own reasons, for protection or affection or advantage. And others still had no choice in the matter, and were wedded off a second time as they had been the first. But for those who could keep it, widowhood offered a thing almost unheard of in that age, a woman living free and in command of her own days. And it is one of the quiet ironies of the age that this should have come only with the grave of the man she had married. The freedom that came to a woman in widowhood was rooted in hard matters of law and property. And it is worth seeing exactly how it worked, for it was the one point at which the law of that age opened a door to a woman rather than closing one. When she married, the holdings that secured her future were settled in two ways. There was her dower, the portion of her husband's estate, by old custom, often a third of it, that the law reserved to her for her lifetime should he die first. And there was, in many marriages, a jointure besides, acres settled jointly upon the couple at the wedding, so that they should pass to whichever of them outlived the other. Upon her husband's death, these estates became hers to hold and to enjoy for the rest of her life. And with them, she stepped into a wholly new condition, for a relict stood before the law as a person in her own right, able to own and to manage property, to make bargains and contracts, to sue and be sued in the courts, to order her own affairs as neither a wife nor an unmarried girl ever could. She had become, in the eyes of the law, her own. With this freedom, many a widow built a long and a powerful later life. As a dowager, she might rule her acres for decades, a formidable old woman managing her estates with a practiced hand, guarding the inheritance of her children, dispensing her own justice and charity, a figure to be courted and feared across the whole country. Some used this new freedom to remarry where they themselves chose, for love or advantage or protection. Others guarded their hard-won freedom and would not marry again for any inducement, and some, wishing to set that independence beyond all challenge, took a solemn vow of chastity before a bishop, becoming what was called a vowess, robed and ringed as a bride of religion, sworn never to wed, and so free to live out their days as their own mistresses, devout and unmolested. To these women, the long widowhood was not a sad and shadowed thing, but the freest and the fullest part of their lives. The years in which at last they were nobody's property but their own. There was, besides, a further hold the age kept upon the widow and her heirs, for if her children were still young when their father died, the law might give their wardship into other hands, and with it the management of their lands and the disposing of their marriages until they came of age. A widow might thus find herself fighting to keep the guardianship of her own children and the control of the inheritance that should one day be theirs against those who had bought or been granted the wardship and meant to profit by it. To hold her family together through such a passage, to defend her children's rights and her own dower against the circling claims of the powerful, took every ounce of the new standing the law had given her. And the widow who managed it was a force indeed. Still, For those who could, widowhood remained the great exception in a woman's bounded world, the one estate in which she might stand free and unowned. And it is among the quiet ironies of her world that this liberty came only over the grave of the man to whom she had been given, and was bought, in the end, with the loss of the husband who had ruled her. For those women who did not marry at all, or who in widowhood or in piety turned away from worldly life, there was another path entirely, lived behind the walls of a nunnery, and it deserves our attention. For the cloister was no mere prison for unwanted daughters, but a real and an honoured calling. A great many noblewomen entered religion across their lives, some as girls given to the church by families with too many daughters to marry off, some as widows retiring from the world, some as women who felt a true vocation and chose the holy existence for its own sake, and within those cloistered walls they found a life of order and devotion, of prayer and work and study, sheltered from the dangers and the demands that ruled the life outside. Nor was it always a place of mere obscure retreat, for the head of a rich nunnery, the abbess, was a woman of real authority and standing, ruling her community with full authority, governing the acres and the wealth that the house held, dealing on equal terms with bishops and lords, a figure of consequence in the realm. To rule a rich abbey was one of the very few positions of independent command open to a woman in that age. And the women who held such places wielded an authority that the wives in their castles might well have envied. The convent offered, too, the rarest of medieval gifts to a woman, which was learning, for behind those walls a woman might read and write and study as she could nowhere else, might keep and copy books, might give her mind to matters beyond the running of a household and the bearing of children. Some of the most learned and gifted women of the age were nuns, who left behind them writings of deep wisdom and beauty, the fruit of lives given over to thought and prayer in the quiet of the cloister. And there were those who went further still into the religious life, the holy women who shut themselves away as solitaries, walled into a small cell beside a church to spend their whole lives in prayer and contemplation, dead to all earthly things and alive only to God. To us, this may seem a grim and a narrow fate, but to the women who chose it, it was a high and a holy calling, an existence of meaning and dignity and peace, and a refuge, perhaps, from an age that offered women so little of their own. The cloister, in all its forms, stood always there as another path, a life apart from marriage and the world, and many a woman found within it the freedom and the purpose she could find nowhere else. The life of the cloister deserves a fuller look, for it was the chief alternative to marriage in a woman's life, and a far richer and more varied thing than we might suppose. A nunnery was a community of women living together under religious vows, set apart from all else to spend their lives in prayer and work and contemplation. And into such houses, the daughters of the nobility came by many roads. Some were given to God as children by families with more daughters than they could dower and marry, placed in the cloister young and raised to the religious life. Some came as widows, retiring from the world when their husbands died to spend their last years in peace and devotion, and some came of their own free choice, drawn by a true vocation to give their lives wholly to God. Once within, they lived by the rule of their order, rising in the dark for the first prayers of the day, and keeping the round of worship through all its hours, dividing their time between the chapel and their work and their studies, in an order and a quiet that the turbulent age outside could never offer. At the head of such a house stood the abbess, and hers was an office unlike any other open to a woman, for it carried a command that no wife and no widow could match. She held sway not only over the souls in her charge, but over broad estates and their revenues, over tenants and rents and the whole worldly business of a wealthy foundation. She sat in her own courts, sent her own men to do her bidding, and treated on level terms with the bishops and barons whose lands marched with hers. Some of the abbesses of the age ranked among the great landholders of their countries, summoned on occasion to answer to the crown for their holdings as any lord might be, and wielding within their own walls an authority that was absolute. For an able and ambitious woman barred from every other high seat, the rule of a great abbey was a prize worth having, a throne in all but name, and the women who reached it governed with a firmness that gave the lie to every notion of the cloister as a place of meek retreat. The daily round of such a house had its own quiet labours beyond the hours of prayer. The sisters copied and illuminated manuscripts in their own hands, kept the accounts and the records of the foundation, tended the sick in the infirmary with their store of herbal physic, taught the young girls placed with them their letters and their needle, and made with their fingers the embroidered cloths and the fine work for which some convents were renowned. It was an ordered, busy, self-governing world, in which a woman might find work for her mind and her hands that the chamber of a castle could never offer. And at the furthest reach of the religious calling stood the anchoress, who took the harder road of solitude, shut into a small cell built against the wall of a church, there to pass her whole remaining span in prayer and counsel, speaking to the world only through a narrow window. And from one such walled-in woman, in her tiny room, came words of comfort and insight that are cherished to this day, long after the voice that framed them fell still. We have spoken much of the splendour and the might of this woman's life, and they were real, but we must end by remembering how fragile that splendour was, how thin the ice on which she walked. For hers was a violent and an uncertain age, and the height of her fortune was also the measure of how far she might fall. The whole of her greatness rested upon her family's standing and the favour of those above them, and both could be lost in a moment. A husband might back the wrong side in a war or a quarrel of kings and lose his head and his acres together, and his wife and children with him be cast down from the heights into ruin and disgrace. A proud house, secure for generations, might be undone in a single season by treason or defeat or the turning of a king's mind. The lady who reigned in her castle one year might be a fugitive or a prisoner the next. Her holdings seized, her husband dead, her children scattered. The whole bright edifice of her fortune brought down about her ears. In an age that settled its quarrels with the sword, the high-born were always the most exposed, and the women shared every danger that fell upon their men. And beyond the perils of politics and war lay the older, deeper dangers that no rank could hold at bay, the dangers of sickness and death that walked so close to every life in that age. The great pestilence that swept across the world in those centuries spared neither high nor low, sweeping off lord and lady and peasant alike in their thousands, emptying castles as it emptied villages. Famine could follow a failed harvest even to the tables of the rich, and over every woman, as we have seen, hung always the shadow of the childbed, the near and constant chance of death in the bearing of the children that were her duty to bear. She buried, almost certainly, some of her own children, and very likely a husband, and friends and kin beyond counting, for death was a familiar visitor in even the greatest houses, and no wealth or rank could send it away. The splendour of her life was real, but it was lived always in the presence of loss, upon the edge of a precipice, in the knowledge that fortune's wheel was forever turning, and that the highest place was also the most perilous. To be a noble lady of this age was to hold a golden cup that might be dashed from her hand at any moment, and she knew it, and lived her bright existence always in the shadow of that knowledge. Death was never far from the people of this age, and they faced it with a directness and a ceremony that we, who hide it away, can scarcely imagine. And for her, as for all, the meeting with the end and the care for what came after it were among the gravest concerns of her life. To die well was held a high art, and a good end was one prepared for and surrounded by ritual. The dying person, knowing the end was near, would make confession and receive the last rites of the church, would forgive and be forgiven, would dispose of worldly goods and commend the soul to God, passing out of life among family and priest, shriven and ready. For the end was not truly an end, but a passage, the gateway to the unending life of the soul beyond. And what mattered above all was that the departed should be sped on the way with every help that faith could give, and should not be forgotten by the living once it was gone. For the great did not simply vanish from the world when they died, they were laid to rest with honour and remembered with care. And the securing of that remembrance was something the lady might plan for through her whole life. The noble dead were laid to rest within the sanctuary itself, hard by the altar beneath tombs of carved stone that bore their likenesses for all to see. She might lie in effigy in her finest robes, her hands folded in prayer, a little dog at her feet, her face turned up toward heaven in eternal devotion, a monument that fixed her memory in stone for the centuries to come. And around the tomb was woven a web of prayer, for the living were bound to pray for the dead, to help their souls through the slow cleansing that the Church taught lay between death and heaven. And the wealthy made sure of those prayers by endowment, founding chantries where priests would sing masses for them, leaving acres and money so that, year after year, their names would be spoken and their souls remembered before God. In this way, the mistress might reach beyond her own death and provide for her spirit and her memory together. And many a noble lady gave deep thought to it, ordering her tomb, founding her chantry, leaving careful instructions for the masses and the alms that should be given for her. It was an act of faith, a provision for the spirit's hard journey. But it was also a bid for remembrance, a way of binding the living to the dead, of making sure she would not be forgotten when she was gone, but would remain in stone and in prayer, a presence among her people and her kin. And in some measure, it worked, for the tombs of these ladies endure still in the old chapels, their carved faces gazing up through the centuries, and we who pause before them and read their names give them, all unknowing, the very remembrance they had so longed for. In her care for death and memory, as in so much of her world, the lady looked beyond the present moment to the far reach of time, and sought, with all the means her age allowed, to leave behind her something that would last. The mark that a great lady left upon her world was often made in stone and glass and gold, through the patronage by which she shaped the religion and the art of her age. And this was among the most lasting of all her works. The piety of the highborn did not stop at private prayer, for those who had riches were expected to use them in the service of God. And a noble family poured a part of its substance into the building and adorning and endowing of holy places. The lady might give to the founding of a church or a chapel, the building of a new aisle or tower, the endowing of a monastery or a convent, the establishing of a chantry where masses would be sung. And in such giving she was often a moving spirit, for such works of piety were close to a woman's heart, and many a religious house and many a fair church owed its existence or its splendour to the devotion and the wealth of a noble lady. Beyond the founding of buildings, her patronage reached into the making of beautiful objects, for she commissioned the art that filled the churches and the homes of the mighty. She paid for the painted book of hours and the embroidered vestment, for the carved tomb and the painted window, for the gold and silver vessels of the altar and the rich hangings of the hall. And in choosing and paying for these, she shaped the taste and the art of her age, a patron whose wealth gave employment to the craftsmen and brought beautiful things into being. Women were among the chief patrons of the loveliest art of the Middle Ages, the little painted prayer books above all, which were so often made for women and to women's taste. And she who commissioned such a treasure was not merely buying an object, but calling a work of beauty into being, leaving her mark upon the culture of her time. There was, in all this giving, a mingling of motives that we should not judge too harshly, for it was piety and display and self-interest all at once. The lady gave to God in true devotion, and to win the prayers that would speed her soul through the long cleansing beyond death. But she gave too, to show the standing of her family, to leave a monument that would carry her name down the years, to bind her memory into the very stones of the churches she endowed. And it worked, for the foundations she made and the beauty she paid for outlasted her by centuries, and many a church, college, and almshouse that still stands was raised by the patronage of some long-dead lady whose name endures because of it. In her patronage, she reached beyond the narrow span of her own life to shape the lasting works of her age, the art and the building and the foundations that would outlive her. And through it she left, upon the face of her age, a deeper and a more enduring mark than her bounded existence might seem to have allowed. But let us come back in these last hours to the day we have been following, for the light is failing now beyond the narrow windows, and the close of the day is drawing on. As the dark gathers outside, the household comes together again, as it had at the height of the day, but in a softer and a warmer mood. For this was the gentlest and the most companionable part of the long day. There was a supper, lighter than the heavy meal of midday, taken as the candles were lit and the shutters closed against the night, and after it, in the hall or in the lady's own chamber, the household gathered about the fire to pass the late hours before sleep in the simple pleasures of the evening that remained. The minstrels played, and there was singing, and sometimes dancing, the stately figures moving in the firelight. Tales were told, the old stories that everyone knew and loved, of heroes and lovers and saints and wonders. And the lord and lady sat among their people in the glow of the flames, at ease at last after the toils of the day. It was the warm heart of the household's life, this closing time, when rank relaxed a little and the whole house drew together in the light against the dark, and it is a scene worth holding in the mind, the bright hall full of music and shadow, walled round by the cold and silent night. The days we have followed turned within a greater wheel, the wheel of the year, and the life of the mistress and her household changed its character with the changing months. For in that age, far more than in ours, the seasons and their round ruled the lives of all. Time itself was reckoned, not by the cold numbers of a calendar, but by the feasts of the church and the labours of the land, so that a thing was remembered as having happened at a certain saint's day, or at harvest, or in the week after Easter. The work of the field set the deep rhythm of it all, the ploughing and the sowing in their seasons, the slow green growing of the summer, the heavy labour of the harvest when every hand was needed to bring the corn home, the slaughter and salting of the beasts as winter closed in, and upon this turning of the farming round the whole wealth of the estate depended, watched over anxiously. For a failed harvest meant hunger even in a castle. Over this rhythm of the land lay the rhythm of religion, the round of holy days and fasts that coloured each part of the year with its own mood and meaning. There were the strict solemn fasts, the weeks of Lent above all, when in their season the household put away meat and rich food and turned to penance and plain fare. And there were the high feasts that broke the fasts with joy, the festivals scattered across the months that were the high points of its world. There was the spring feast of the Lord's Rising, kept after the long privation of Lent with rejoicing and the return of richer fare. There were the bright saints' days scattered through the calendar, each with its own customs and observances. And there was the great celebration of midwinter, of which more must be said in its place, the brightest of them all. These festivals were not mere holidays, but the very framework of the months, the bright fixed points by which the dark and the labour of the year were measured and made bearable. So her life turned with the seasons, each turn bringing its own work and its own pleasures and its own dangers. The bright energy of spring and the long labour of summer gave way to the rich abundance and the hard toil of autumn. And so to the shut-in cold of winter, when the household drew close about its fires and lived upon the stores so carefully laid up, and the midwinter revel blazed up to defy the cold. Through it all the round of worship turned, marking the holy seasons, and through it all the lady kept her household, adjusting its life to the demands of each part of the year, feasting and fasting as the calendar required, watching the harvest and guarding the stores, and keeping the festivals with due splendour. Her days ran not in our straight line of marching dates, but in this great turning circle of the months. The same round of toil and worship and festival that her mother had known and her daughter would know. The deep, slow wheel upon which the whole of that world revolved. Of all the seasons that turned the wheel of her year, winter pressed hardest upon the life of the castle, and it is worth dwelling on, for the frozen half of the year shaped the noblewoman's days in ways we, with our warm and lighted homes, can scarcely feel. When the short dark days closed in and the cold came down upon the land, the chill stone house became a hard place to live, for all the fires that could be built. The thick walls that kept out an enemy kept in the chill and the damp, and held them long after the brief winter sun had set. The rooms were raw and draughty. The wind found every gap in the shutters. The smoke of the fires hung in the air and stung the eyes, and the people of the household went about, muffled in furs and heavy wool, their breath smoking, their hands and feet aching with the frost. The bright short days gave way early to the long black evenings, lit only by the leaping flames and the costly candles, and the whole life of the house drew inward and downward, huddling close to the hearth against the dark and the chill that pressed at every window. It was a time of scarcity as well as of chill, for the green abundance of summer was long gone, and the household lived now upon the stores, so carefully laid up against this very time, the salted meat and the dried fish, the grain and the ale and the withering apples, the food that had to last until the distant spring. A poorly stocked house might go hungry before the winter ended, and even a rich one ate plainer and narrower fare as the cold months wore on. The fresh and the green were only a memory, and the table grew monotonous with the preserved and the stored. It was a hungry time, too, for the poor of the estate, who came to the castle gate in greater numbers as their own scant stores failed, and upon whom her winter charity might mean the difference between life and death. The frost itself killed, carrying off the old and the weak and the very young, and sickness spread in the close, shut-in rooms. And so this was a season not only of discomfort, but of real danger, endured rather than enjoyed, watched through with longing for the return of the light. Yet into the darkest heart of this hard season, the age set its brightest festival, the midwinter feast, as if in defiance of the cold and the dark. And the contrast was the very point of it. When the year was at its blackest and the land at its deadest, the hall blazed up with fire and warmth and plenty, decked with green against the bare land outside, loud with music and laughter and the gathering of the whole household and its dependents in feasting and games and good cheer. For a span of days the scarcity was set aside, and the stores were opened, and the chill was shut out. And the people of the castle drew together in warmth and brightness and fellowship against the long blackness of the year. It was the lady's part to keep that feast with all due splendour, to make the bright heart of the cold months blaze as it should. And there was a deep wisdom in it, this kindling of joy at the very floor of the year, this insistence upon light and warmth and gathering when the world outside was darkest. The season was hard, but the feast defied it, and she kept both the long endurance and the bright defiance as part of the turning rhythm of her life. When at last the fire burned low and the evening wore toward its end, the household made ready for sleep. The fires were banked and the candles snuffed. The watch was set upon the walls, the gates were barred, and one by one the people of the castle sought their beds, the servants on their pallets in the hall, the gentlefolk in their chambers above. The lady went up at last to the room where we first found her, and her women loosed her gown and unpinned her hair and helped her to her rest. And she spoke her last prayer of the day and lay down. The bed was closed about her once more, and she gave herself to sleep in the warmth of it. Her women near at hand, her long day's work behind her at last. Outside, the great stone house stood black and silent under the stars, its fires dying, its people sleeping, its lady at rest in the heart of it. And the long medieval night closed over the castle and the village and the whole sleeping land, as it had closed 1,000 times before, and would close 1,000 more times over. The day we have followed was over, and tomorrow would bring another very like it, and another after that. The slow, unending round of a life, lived by the turning of the seasons and the tolling of the bells. Such was the shape of her days, year upon year, but a life is more than its days, and we should pause, before we let her go, to think of the full arc of it, from the bright girl given in marriage to the old woman at the last. If she was fortunate, if she came through the perils of the childbed and the dangers of her violent age, she might live to grow old, and old age could be, for such a woman, a span of honour and even of power. As a widow she might rule her dower lands in her own right, a grand old dowager respected and a little feared. The matriarch of a wide family of children and grandchildren whom she had launched into the world, she might give her last years to religion, retiring at length into a convent to prepare her soul for the end, or living quietly in her own house among her women and her memories. She had done what her age asked of her. She had married where she was bid, in her time, borne the children of her house, held its acres and its honour through war and peace, given alms to the poor and prayers to God, and carried the full weight of a noble household upon her shoulders through all the seasons of her strength. And when at last she came to die, she was laid with honour beneath the stones of the church she had endowed, her likeness carved upon her tomb, her soul commended to the mercy she had served. And the children she had raised and the foundations she had made carried her memory forward into the days she would not see. And so we come to the end of her day and her life, and the moment has come to let her rest at last. What are we to make of her, this proud lady of a vanished age, whose hours we have shared from the chill, waking before dawn, to the banking of the last fire at night? She was not the idle ornament of the old stories, nor yet was she free in any way we would recognize. She was something stranger and more interesting than either, a woman of enormous responsibility and real power who was yet, in the deepest things, not her own. She ran a vast enterprise, dispensed justice, healed the sick, defended castles, and held the fortunes of a noble house in her two hands. And she did all of this while owning nothing in her own name, choosing nothing of the great matters of her life, married where she was told, and bound where she was placed, her very body given over, again and again, to the perilous duty of bearing heirs. She was at once among the mightiest, and among the most bound of all the people of her world, and in that strange doubleness lies the deepest truth of her, and much of the truth of her age. We have walked a single day at her side, and seen a little of what it really meant to be such a woman, and perhaps, having seen it, we shall not so easily picture her again as the pale and idle lady of the tower, but as what she truly was, the strong and weary and capable mistress of a hard and a beautiful world. There are two images of her that we might carry away with us into the quiet of this night. The first is the mistress in her power and her splendour, robed in silk and fur and gold, moving through the bright hall of her castle, with her keys at her girdle and her people about her. the mistress of all she surveys, dispensing justice and largesse, holding a small world together by the strength of her will and her care. Hold that image a moment, the proud lady in her glory, in the full noon of her strength and her station, queen of her own small kingdom. As fine and as formidable a figure as that whole age could show. It is the picture the old tales gave us, and it is true, as far as it goes. And then set beside it the other image, the truer and the deeper one, of the same woman in the lying-in chamber, in the deep of the night, alone in the end, despite all her women, walking down into the valley of the shadow to bring a new life into the world and not knowing whether she would come back. That is the other truth of her, the price beneath the splendor, the danger beneath the gold. And to hold the two images together, the lady in her glory and the woman in her peril, is to understand at last what it really meant to be one of the fortunate women of that distant age. She was given much, and much was asked of her, and she paid for her high place with a courage we can only wonder at. Between those two images, the bright hall and the shadowed chamber, lies the whole truth of her singular life. So let her rest now, the proud lady of the castle, and all her household with her, in the deep quiet that gathers at the end of every day and every age. Let the fires of the hall burn down to embers, and the candles gutter out one by one, and the cold night settle over the towers and the sleeping land. Let her lie at peace in the warm dark of her bed among her women, her long day's labour done, her cares laid down, with nothing now to hold or to fear. The seasons have turned and turned again since she lived and laboured and was laid to rest. The very castle has crumbled into grass. And yet for this one evening she has walked among us again, and we have shared her hours. And now we may let her go gently back into the silence from which we called her. There is nothing left to do now, and naught left to fear. Only the quiet and the stillness, and the long ease of sleep. And as her world grows dim and still around us, let yours grow dim and still as well. The night is far on now, and you have travelled a long way back into it, and there is no more for you to hold on to. Let the candles of that vanished castle gutter out one by one. Let the old voices fade. Let the warmth of your own bed gather you in, and your breath grow slow and even, and your thoughts loosen their hold and begin to drift away into the dark, down toward the place where the story and the sleeper become one, and the night closes gently over all. Before you slip away entirely, let me thank you, quietly, for spending these few hours of the night in such old and faraway company. If the evening we have passed together is the kind of journey you would care to take again, you are always welcome to subscribe whenever the wish should come to you. And another of these still evenings will find its way to you in time. There is no hurry about any of it. It is simply here, waiting, whenever you should want to come back. But that is a matter for the daylight. And the daylight is far off. For now there is only the dark, and the rest you have earned. And the last few words I leave with you as you go: sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.